Welcome, weary wanderers and curious insomniacs, to At Hollow Midnight. If the quiet hum of the night finds you restless, perhaps a gentle distraction is precisely what you need. Consider subscribing, and let the peculiar tales of history's forgotten corners lull your mind, not necessarily to sleep, but into a pleasant state of mild contemplation. Chapter 1. The Sleepwalking Monarch in the venerable, albeit slightly draughty, kingdom of Ethelberg, a peculiar and rather inconvenient truth, often shadowed the sun-drenched days and star-speckled nights. King Alaric, its benevolent but perpetually bewildered monarch, was an inveterate sleepwalker. This was not a mere occasional amble from bed to an open window for a forgotten breath of night air. Alaric's nocturnal perambulations were, to put it mildly, an elaborate, often disruptive, and thoroughly baffling expedition. His subconscious self possessed an adventurous spirit entirely absent from his waking persona, which was, by all accounts, rather fond of warm slippers and undisturbed silence. The royal castle of Ethelberg, a sprawling edifice of grey stone and polished oak, with its labyrinthine corridors and countless echoing chambers, was, to King Alaric's sleepwalking self, less a fortified residence and more an intricate, personal obstacle course. His waking self navigated it with the aid of maps and an attentive retinue. His sleeping self, however, navigated it with the intuitive certainty of a particularly determined badger. The guards, those stoic, broad-shouldered men tasked with the kingdom's security, found themselves, to their collective dismay, spending a significant portion of their night shifts playing an involuntary and highly undignified game of Find the King. It began subtly, as most chronic inconveniences do. A misplaced royal scepter found later amongst the kitchen's discarded potato peelings. A particularly important diplomatic missive discovered crumpled beneath a tapestry depicting the Battle of the Muddy Fields, its seals broken and its contents annotated with what appeared to be grape jelly. Initially, these incidents were attributed to the general inefficiencies of court staff or perhaps a rogue draft. But as the frequency escalated, and the nature of the discoveries grew more bizarre, the truth, uncomfortable as it was, began to assert itself. It was the king. It was always the king. One memorable Tuesday, which had started with the usual Ethelbergian drizzle, Lord Chancellor Fitzwilliam, a man whose patience was as thin and brittle as old parchment, discovered His Majesty perched atop the grand marble fountain in the castle's central courtyard. The king was clad only in his voluminous, albeit rather stained, nightshirt, humming a tuneless ditty, and attempting to instruct the stone cherubs on proper angling techniques for their water jets. He seemed quite content, if a little damp. Lord Fitzwilliam, however, was not content. He was, in fact, verging on a state of apoplexy usually reserved for news of invading barbarians or a sudden shortage of spiced wine. The king, once gently roused, had no recollection of his aquatic adventure, merely blinking owlishly and complaining of a sudden chill. The guards, poor souls, bore the brunt of Alaric's unconscious wanderings. There was Sir Calin, whose particularly robust snoring habit often provided a rhythmic backdrop to the castle's nocturnal stillness, until one night he awoke, not to the familiar echo of his own nasal efforts, but to the cold, bare foot of the king stepping firmly upon his face. Alaric, seemingly engrossed in inspecting the intricate pattern of the ceiling plaster, had merely paused to use Sir Calin's prostrate form as an impromptu stepping stool. Sir Calin, a veteran of numerous border skirmishes, later claimed this singular incident was far more humiliating than any arrow wound. The royal advisers, a collection of venerable gentlemen whose collective wisdom was meant to guide the kingdom through the treacherous waters of diplomacy and fiscal policy, found their most pressing daily concern to be the mitigation of royal embarrassment. They established a nocturnal sovereign retrieval protocol, an elaborate system of whispered alerts, softly padded shoes, and strategically placed bowls of warm milk, though the latter was more for the exhausted guards than the king, who rarely paused for a refreshment break during his expeditions. They debated the efficacy of tethers, of locked doors, of sleeping draughts, all of which proved utterly useless against the king's sleep-induced ingenuity. A particularly strong door, bolted from the outside, merely meant King Alaric would find himself in the royal armory, attempting to don a suit of plate armor, clanking and rattling his way through the midnight silence, sounding like a disgruntled ghost on a particularly noisy scavenger hunt. The royal tailor, Master Cuthbert, a man of perpetual sighs and even more perpetual frowns, found his workload significantly increased. King Alaric's nightshirts, once pristine garments of the finest linen, invariably returned to Cuthbert's workshop torn, mud-splattered, or mysteriously imbued with the scent of stable hay. Cuthbert suspected the king had a particular fondness for visiting the royal stables in his sleep, perhaps to commune with the war horses, though no one had ever witnessed such an encounter. The horses, for their part, seemed entirely unfazed by the occasional disheveled monarch who would appear briefly in their midst before wandering off again. Perhaps they simply assumed it was part of their elaborate dream lives. It was not merely the castle interior that bore witness to Alaric's somnambulistic escapades. On one occasion, a particularly thick fog had descended upon Athelberg, cloaking the cobbled streets and ancient market square in an ethereal shroud. The town watch, usually reliant on their lanterns and the occasional barking dog to guide them, found themselves navigating by sound. Imagine their surprise, then, when a figure emerged from the swirling mist, clad in what appeared to be a slightly askew crown atop a very rumpled nightshirt, muttering about the urgent need to reorganize the municipal flower beds. It was King Alaric, of course, having somehow bypassed the castle's outer defenses, wandered through the main gate, and was now, apparently, offering unsolicited horticultural advice to a startled night watchman. The watchman, a man named Bartholomew, who had seen many strange things in his tenure, simply tipped his cap, saluted, and then, with a profound sigh, gently guided his sovereign back towards the castle, all the while pretending that this was an entirely normal occurrence for the hour of 3 a.m. The kingdom, as a whole, had learned to live with its sleepwalking monarch. It was an open secret, whispered in taverns and gossiped about in market stalls. Yet there was a certain fondness for Alaric's quirks. He was, after all, a good king in his waking hours. Fair, if a little dull, just if a little predictable. His nocturnal adventures, while tiresome for those directly involved, lent a certain whimsical absurdity to the otherwise rather staid court of Athelberg. It was a kingdom where the greatest threat was not a foreign invasion, but the possibility of stepping on the king's discarded royal slippers in the hallway at dawn. The advisors, after years of trial and error, had settled into a routine. Every evening before the king retired, they would conduct a final exhaustive sweep of his chambers, ensuring no sharp objects, no crucial documents, and certainly no means of egress were within his immediate unconscious grasp. Then, once the castle was quiet, the night sentinels, a specially designated unit, would begin their patrol. Their primary mission: to prevent King Alaric from encountering anything more dangerous than a cold draught, or, worse still, from being discovered in a compromising position, such as attempting to milk a stone gargoyle or leading a choir of phantom mice in a rousing anthem. Despite all precautions, Alaric's uncanny ability to find an escape route remained unchallenged. A slightly ajar window, a forgotten service door, a secret passage known only to the castle's oldest resident, Alaric, in his slumber, seemed to possess a map of these hidden routes, far more accurate than any drawn by the royal cartographers. It was as if his dreaming mind sought out the very edges of his known world, pushing against the boundaries of Athelberg itself. And so the kingdom braced itself each night, wondering where the king's next unconscious journey might take him, blissfully unaware that one night, very soon, Those boundaries might not be enough to contain the peculiar wanderlust of King Alaric's sleeping mind. The peculiar nocturnal peregrinations of King Alaric had, by this point, ceased to be a mere curiosity, and had escalated into a matter of urgent, kingdom-wide concern. The night sentinels, those weary custodians of the king's sleep-addled wanderings, reported an alarming increase in the complexity and geographical spread of His Majesty's unconscious expeditions. One particularly harrowing report detailed the king's successful nocturnal escape from the castle confines entirely, culminating in his discovery attempting to barter a rather valuable gilded chamber pot for a half-eaten turnip with a startled farmer's wife at 4 a.m, miles outside the city walls. The chamber pot, it was noted, had been an heirloom. The farmer's wife, bless her pragmatic heart, had been momentarily tempted. This incident, more than any other, prompted Lord Chancellor Fitzwilliam to declare, with a voice trembling somewhere between exasperation and sheer existential dread, that something, anything, must be done. The king's dignity, already teetering precariously on the precipice of public amusement, could not withstand another such assault. Thus, it was that Dr. Phineas Oakhaven, the royal physician, a man whose medical theories were as intricate and often as opaque as the lace on his rather unhygienic cuffs, was summoned. Dr. Oakhaven was a figure of considerable gravitas, at least in his own estimation. He possessed a beard of impressive, untamid proportions, the color of a storm cloud on a particularly gloomy Tuesday, and eyes that, when not obscured by the thick lenses of his spectacles, held a perpetually distant, contemplative gaze, as if he were constantly peering into the very fabric of existence, or perhaps just trying to remember where had left his quill. His methods were, to put it mildly, unorthodox. He championed the medicinal properties of badger spleen, insisted on examining the exact phase of the moon before prescribing a laxative, and believed passionately in the therapeutic effects of being read particularly dry tax ledgers. He spent 3 days and 3 nights in the king's chambers, observing, jotting down notes in a tiny illegible script, and occasionally muttering to himself in a language that sounded suspiciously like a forgotten dialect of ancient poultry. He measured the king's breathing with a silver pendulum, checked the temperature of his pillow with a small enchanted thermometer that glowed faintly, and even, to the utter bewilderment of the night sentinels, sampled the air in the royal bedchamber at various intervals, sniffing it with the intense concentration of a truffle hound. His findings, he announced to the assembled court, were both profound and, he assured them, entirely coherent, given the proper understanding of humoral flux and celestial resonance. The court, assembled in the grand audience chamber, consisted of Lord Chancellor Fitzwilliam, whose forehead was permanently furrowed from years of worry, General Magnus, a man whose primary concern was the strategic implications of the king ending up in a hostile territory, and Lady Beatrice, the Queen's chief lady-in-waiting, who simply wished for a good night's sleep. They sat in expectant, nervous silence, the air thick with the scent of old wood and the unspoken anxieties of royal inconvenience. Dr. Oakhaven cleared his throat, a sound like gravel tumbling down a particularly steep hill, and began. "My esteemed colleagues," he intoned, sweeping his gaze across the room, after extensive observation, meticulous analysis, and a rather regrettable incident involving a minor explosion in the Royal Alchemist's lab, entirely unrelated. "I assure you I have arrived at a conclusive diagnosis regarding His Majesty King Alaric's nocturnal perambulations." He paused for dramatic effect, allowing the anticipation to build, much like a particularly stubborn yeast in a warm oven. "The root cause," he continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, "lies not in the realm of the psychological, nor the spiritual, but rather, profoundly, in the peculiar interaction between fermented goat milk and the waxing gibbous moon." A collective gasp, followed by a series of muffled coughs, rippled through the chamber. Lord Fitzwilliam's yaw, which had been set in a grim line of readiness for a complex medical explanation, dropped slightly. General Magnus scratched his head, a gesture usually reserved for puzzling battle formations. Lady Beatrice, ever composed, merely raised one perfectly sculpted eyebrow, a fraction of an inch. Dr. Oakhaven, oblivious to their incredulity, pressed on, warming to his absurd thesis. You see, dear friends, the king, in his daily regimen, consumes a modest, yet consistent, quantity of goat milk, dark kind. This, in itself, is innocuous. However, the specific strain of goat, the rare Ethelbergian grey-horned, produces a milk with an unusually high concentration of what I have termed, for brevity, somnambulistic peptides. These peptides, when exposed to the atmospheric pressures of a full or near-full lunar cycle, particularly during the waxing gibbous phase, undergo a subtle yet potent fermentation within the royal digestive tract. He gestured expansively with a long bony finger, as if painting a complex biochemical reaction in the air. This internal fermentation, he elaborated, creates a unique gaseous byproduct, a kind of ethereal vapor, which then rises, you see, directly to the king's cranial cavity, influencing the delicate dendrites of the cerebellum. The cerebellum, as any amateur anatomist will tell you, governs balance and coordinated movement. Under the influence of these specific lunar-activated peptides, the king's cerebellum enters a heightened state of paradoxical nocturnal activation. While his conscious mind slumbers, the cerebellum, stimulated by the moon-fermented vapor, perceives an urgent, compelling need for locomotion. It is, in essence, a somnambulistic compass, pointing him ever outwards. Lord Fitzwilliam, recovering slightly, managed to stammer, "But fermented goat milk, doctor." "And the moon?" "Precisely. Lord Chancellor." Dr. Oakhaven beamed, as if he had just discovered the cure for all known ailments. "It is a dance, a celestial ballet between caprine lactations and gravitational pull. The moon's gravitational force, subtle yet pervasive, amplifies the fermentation process within the king's gut. The stronger the moon's pull, the more potent the somnambulistic peptides become. Ergo, during the waxing gibbous, when the moon is growing larger and its influence more pronounced, the king's nightly adventures become more ambitious, more far-reaching, more prone to involving heirloom chamber pots and bewildered farmers' wives." He gave a knowing nod, clearly delighted with his own intellectual prowess. General Magnus, who had managed to follow the explanation with the same degree of understanding he applied to deciphering ancient elvish scrolls, grunted, "So, Izzy's gassy. Because of the moon?" Dr. Oakhaven winced slightly. A crude, yet not entirely inaccurate simplification, General. It is a highly specialized, noble gas, unique to the royal digestive system, reacting with the cosmic energies of the lunar sphere. He then produced a rolled parchment from within his voluminous robes. "My proposed course of treatment is twofold, and remarkably straightforward given the exquisite complexity of the malady. Firstly, King Alaric must abstain, absolutely, and without deviation, from all forms of goat milk, fermented or otherwise. He will instead consume only the milk of a specially bred, exceptionally placid Jersey cow, known for its calming non-peptidic properties. Secondly, during the waxing gibbous phase, and indeed during the full moon, the king's sleeping chambers must be fitted with moon-repelling curtains." "Moon-repelling curtains?" Lady Beatrice inquired, a hint of genuine curiosity finally breaking through her stoic demeanor. "Indeed," Dr. Oakhaven declared, gesturing grandly. "Crafted from the finest, darkest velvet, woven with threads of silver, as you know, has a natural antipathy to lunar emanations, and perhaps imbued with a faint scent of garlic and rosemary. known for their warding properties against errant nocturnal energies. These curtains, when drawn, will create a hermetically sealed lunar nullification zone around the king's bed, thereby preventing the peptides from reaching their full somnambulistic potential. Lord Fitzwilliam rubbed his temples, a headache of monumental proportions beginning to bloom behind his eyes. So, no goat milk, and very dark. Garlic-scented curtains for a week out of every month. This is your solution, Doctor, to the king sleepwalking into other kingdoms? It is the only logical and medically sound solution, Lord Chancellor, Dr. Oakhaven stated with unwavering conviction. The science, though perhaps novel to the uninitiated, is irrefutable. We suppress the internal fermentation, and we block the external lunar stimulant. The king's cerebellum will then return to its natural somnolent state. He will sleep soundly, undisturbed by the cosmic urges to reenact ancient agricultural bartering rituals. The court, despite their lingering doubts and the sheer absurdity of the pronouncement, found themselves with little recourse. Years of more conventional treatments, gentle restraints, soothing lullabies, even a brief disastrous attempt at hypnotism had all failed. The king continued to wonder. If moon-repelling curtains and a ban on goat milk were the price of a peaceful night's rest for the entire kingdom, then so be it. They were desperate. They were tired. And frankly, the idea of Alaric trying to negotiate a trade agreement with a startled badger during the next full moon was too terrifying to contemplate. So, the decree was issued. The royal kitchens were informed, to the bewilderment of the head chef, that all goat milk was henceforth forbidden for His Majesty's consumption. Special orders were dispatched for a particularly placid Jersey cow. And the royal tailor, Master Cuthbert, already burdened by the perpetual need to repair Alaric's tattered nightshirts, was tasked with the daunting and frankly rather bizarre commission of crafting moon-repelling curtains from quantities of silver thread and velvet previously reserved for the Queen's winter gowns. Cuthbert, a man whose size could deflate a hot air balloon, merely shook his head and began to sketch designs, wondering if he should also incorporate small, embroidered garlic cloves into the fabric for good measure. The court held its breath, waiting for the next full moon. Dr. Oakhaven's confidence was absolute, almost infectious. Yet, underneath the veneer of his scientific certainty, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor of anticipation ran through the castle. Would the peculiar dance of fermented goat milk and lunar cycles truly be the key? Or would King Alaric, in his profound unconscious wisdom, find yet another, even more imaginative way to venture beyond the boundaries of Ethelberg, perhaps even, unwittingly, into a domain far stranger than his own? The quiet hum of the night, now accompanied by the rustle of newly hung, very dark, very heavy curtains, seemed to hold its own secret. Chapter 3. The fateful night the week that followed Dr. Phineas Oakhaven's startling, yet undeniably unique, diagnosis was a period of peculiar tension within the venerable walls of Castle Ethelberg. The air, usually thick with the scent of roasted meats and old parchment, now carried faint competing whiffs of Jersey cow milk, freshly brewed rosemary tea, and perhaps most notably the faint, yet persistent tongue of garlic that seemed to emanate from the royal bedchamber. Master Cuthbert, the royal tailor, had indeed taken Dr. Oakhaven's instructions to heart, crafting curtains of such oppressive darkness that they seemed to absorb all light and hope, interwoven with shimmering silver threads and subtly embroidered with tiny stylized garlic cloves. These were, by all accounts, the most moon-repelling curtains ever conceived, or at least the most pungent. King Alaric, meanwhile, had, with a monarchical shrug of resignation, abandoned his beloved goat milk in favor of the bland, yet reputedly non-somnambulistic, Jersey cow variety. He found it less invigorating, certainly, and a trifle watery. But if it meant an end to his embarrassing nocturnal expeditions, he was willing to make the sacrifice. Or rather, his waking self was willing. His sleeping self, as was abundantly clear, had never really consulted his waking self on matters of itinerary or beverage preference. As the waxing gibbous moon swelled in the night sky, slowly approaching its full luminous zenith, a palpable anxiety settled over the castle. The night sentinels, those stalwarts of royal slumber security, were doubled, their ranks swollen with fresh recruits, all briefed on the nuances of Dr. Oakhaven's lunar peptide theory, and equipped with new extra-soft slippers. Lord Chancellor Fitzwilliam, a man who now slept with one eye perpetually open, had taken to reviewing the castle's entire inventory of ropes and pulleys, just in case a particularly strong tether might yet prove effective. Despite past failures, General Magnus, ever pragmatic, had positioned several squads of the Royal Guard in discreet locations along the castle's perimeter, their primary directive being to intercept a royal nightshirted figure before he could engage in any further unscheduled diplomatic incidents with local livestock. The fateful night arrived with an almost theatrical solemnity. The moon, a gleaming orb of pearlescent light, hung high above Athelberg, casting long, stark shadows across the sleeping kingdom. Dr. Oakhaven, bedecked in a ceremonial gown of striped silk, supervised the drawing of the moon-repelling curtains in the king's bedchamber, muttering incantations and sprinkling pinches of dried herbs into the folds of the heavy fabric. Morning. The air in the room grew thick and still, the silver threads in the curtain seeming to hum with an almost palpable tension, as if actively repelling the very lunar rays that sought to penetrate the glass. The initial hours passed in an eerie, uncharacteristic quiet. The night sentinels reported nothing. The palace hummed with the soft, steady breathing of hundreds of sleeping souls. Lord Fitzwilliam, who had stationed himself outside the royal bedchamber, began to allow a fragile sprout of hope to blossom in his weary heart. Perhaps, just perhaps, Dr. Oakhaven's eccentric genius had triumphed. Perhaps the goat milk was indeed the culprit, and the moon-repelling curtains the antidote. He permitted himself a rare, almost imperceptible smile. Then, just as the moon reached its highest point in the sky, a faint, rhythmic thumping began to emanate from within the king's chamber. It was a peculiar sound, not unlike a particularly large, dignified beetle attempting to ascend a very smooth wall. Lord Fitzwilliam's fragile hope withered instantly, replaced by the familiar prickle of dread. He pressed an ear to the heavy oak door, straining to discern the nature of the thumping. It grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by a soft, scraping noise. Inside the bedchamber, King Alaric, clad in his customary voluminous nightshirt, and oddly his polished crown, was engaged in what appeared to be an entirely new form of nocturnal exercise. He was not attempting to open a window, nor was he trying to unlock the door. Instead, with the focused intensity of a child attempting to solve a particularly difficult puzzle, he was meticulously, and with surprising strength, scaling the very moon-repelling curtains themselves. His bare feet, usually accustomed to plush carpets, found porches in the heavy velvet folds, and his hands, usually occupied with state documents, gripped the thick silver threads with surprising dexterity. He was, it seemed, attempting to reach the highest point of the window frame, perhaps believing it to be a particularly challenging mountain peak. The thumping Lord Fitzwilliam heard was the sound of the king's knees making contact with the windowsill as he hauled himself up, a feat of unconscious athleticism that would have utterly bewildered his waking self. With a final, silent grunt, Alaric's somnambulistic form, propelled by an unknown internal urge that defied all medical explanation, squeezed through a narrow, unnoticed gap at the very top of the window frame, a gap that had been deemed far too small for any human to pass through, especially one of Alaric's robust dimensions. It was as if, in his sleep, he had temporarily forgotten the inconvenient strictures of human anatomy. He landed with a soft, almost graceful thud on the narrow stone ledge outside, a dizzying height above the castle courtyard. The night sentinels below, startled by the faint sound, looked up, their eyes widening in collective horror. There, silhouetted against the brilliant moon, stood King Alaric, his nightshirt billowing gently in the breeze, his crown glinting like a stray star. He looked, for all the world, like a particularly eccentric, disoriented angel. "The king! He's on the ledge!" a sentinel whispered, his voice choked with disbelief. Before anyone could react, before the specialized ladder could be fetched, before Dr. Oakhaven could theorize about the effects of lunar-activated peptides on adhesive skin cells, King Alaric took a step. Not a step back into the safety of his room, but a step forward onto the precarious gables of the castle roof. He walked with the effortless confidence of a tightrope walker, his bare feet gripping the ancient tiles, his gaze fixed on some unseen point on the horizon, his crown a beacon in the moonlight. The night sentinels and the royal guard were now engaged in a desperate, silent pursuit. They clambered onto the rooftops from various towers, their soft slippers proving remarkably useful for once, trying to keep up with their agile, sleep-addled sovereign. Alaric, however, possessed an uncanny sense of nocturnal navigation. He moved with a speed and certainty that astonished even the most seasoned trackers. He scaled walls that seemed unclimbable, traversed yawning chasms between turrets with casual leaps that made his pursuers blanch, and slid down rainwater pipes with the nonchalance of a practiced rogue. His path led him not through the usual castle gates, but along the very perimeter walls high above the sleeping town. He seemed to float over obstacles, his white nightshirt a ghostly blur against the dark stone. Below, a startled cat, mid-chase of a particularly plump mouse, paused, its whiskers twitching as the crowned, night-shirted figure glided past above it. A drunkard, stumbling home after a long night at the Rusty Flagon, looked up, blinked twice, and then decided he'd had far too much ale, for he could have sworn he just saw the king in his night clothes dancing on the rooftops. Alaric's journey continued relentlessly outwards. He bypassed the main gate, which was naturally locked and guarded. By simply descending a crumbling section of the outer wall that no one had thought to repair in decades, largely because it looked too dangerous to even approach, he landed softly in a patch of overgrown nettles outside the castle grounds, seemingly unfazed by the sting. His crown, miraculously, remained firmly affixed. He then proceeded, with an unnerving sense of purpose, to march through the silent, misty lanes of Athelburg. The town, accustomed to the king's occasional nocturnal escapades, was mostly asleep, but those few who were awake bore witness to the extraordinary spectacle. A baker, rising early to knead dough, peered out his window to see his monarch, regal yet disheveled, stride past, muttering something about the optimal air circulation for fermented radish preserves. A startled stable boy, tending to a foaling mare, watched in stunned silence as the king, nightshirt flapping, sauntered into the adjacent field, seemingly intent on inspecting a particularly stubborn turnip patch. The night sentinels, now joined by General Magnus himself, a man whose exhaustion was now matched only by his profound sense of bewilderment, followed at a discreet distance, trying to anticipate Alaric's next move. But Alaric was unpredictable. He would veer off down a narrow alleyway, cut through a startled farmer's field, or even, on one occasion, pause to gently pat a sleeping cow on the nose before continuing his inexorable journey. His path was not random. It seemed guided by an invisible thread, leading him ever onward, away from the familiar comforts and confines of Athelburg. The air grew colder as the night wore on. The moon, though still high, had begun its slow descent, its light softening into a diffuse glow. Alaric, seemingly immune to the chill, maintained his steady, purposeful gait. He had bypassed the last of the farmsteads, skirted the edges of the whispering woods, and was now treading a path rarely used by anyone, a forgotten track that led towards the desolate, mist-shrouded moors that marked the ancient, ill-defined border of Ethelberg. The night sentinels, their breaths misting in the pre-dawn air, exchanged worried glances. This was unprecedented. The king had never ventured this far. The moors were known for their treacherous bogs and their unsettling silence. They were also known, in hushed whispers, as the unofficial dividing line between Ethelberg and the notoriously peculiar kingdom of Eldoria, a place rarely spoken of and even more rarely visited. King Alaric, oblivious to the increasing alarm of his trailing guardians, reached a large, moss-covered standing stone, a relic of an age long past, which marked the highest point of the moor. He paused there for a moment, silhouetted against the paling sky, his crown still perfectly straight. He seemed to take a deep, contented breath, as if he had reached a long-sought destination. Then, with a turn that was both decisive and utterly unthinking, he stepped past the standing stone. He was no longer in Ethelberg. He was, quite unequivocally, now in Eldoria. The air, already thin and cold, seemed to shift, to acquire a subtle, almost imperceptible tang of something unfamiliar, something that hinted at strange flora and even stranger customs. The path he had taken, once merely a forgotten track, now seemed to stretch out before him, inviting, beckoning. King Alaric, the sleepwalking monarch, had, against all odds, defied the moon-repelling curtains, the cow milk, and every ounce of Dr. O'Caven's scientific reasoning. He had not merely escaped his castle, he had, with the unconscious elegance of a dream, walked himself directly into the wrong kingdom, clad only in his nightshirt and his slightly askew crown, entirely unaware of the profound implications of his nocturnal journey. The night sentinels could only watch, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and a dawning, terrible realization that their most challenging task had just begun. He was gone, truly, undeniably, wonderfully gone, and the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, promising a day of truly monumental explanations. Chapter 4. The Borderlands of Misunderstanding. The dawn, when it finally crept over the desolate moors that formed the ancient, often disputed border between Ethelberg and Eldoria, brought with it not the promise of a new day, but the creeping dread of an unfolding international incident. King Alaric, the sleepwalking monarch, had, with an unconscious elegance that defied both gravity and political common sense, stepped beyond the familiar, if sometimes irritating, confines of his own kingdom. The last moss-covered standing stone, a silent sentinel of forgotten treaties and minor skirmishes, now stood firmly behind him, marking a definitive, if entirely accidental, departure from his domain. He continued his somnambulistic march, his voluminous nightshirt billowing softly in the pre-dawn breeze, his crown, miraculously, still perched upon his head with a defiant, if slightly askew, dignity. The landscape of Eldoria was subtly, yet distinctly, different from Ethelberg. Here, the land was wilder, the mists clung lower and thicker, imbued with the scent of unfamiliar, peaty earth and the faint, metallic tang of ancient, undiscovered minerals. The trees, snarled and twisted, seemed to whisper secrets in a language only the wind understood. The air itself felt heavier, imbued with an ancient stillness that Ethelberg, for all its history, had somehow managed to lose amidst the clatter of carts and the drone of royal proclamations. Alaric, of course, noticed none of this. His mind, locked in the profound, unfathomable logic of sleep, merely registered a continuation of his personal, internal expedition. He navigated the uneven terrain with the same placid determination he might apply to finding a lost slipper, stepping over gnarled roots and around stagnant puddles with an almost preternatural grace. He hummed a tuneless, nasal melody, a sound often associated with the royal snoring, utterly oblivious to the profound geographical and political transgression he was committing with every gentle, barefooted stride. The first to encounter this surreal vision were two Eldorian shepherds, brothers named Gorok and Thistle, who were attempting to coax a particularly stubborn flock of shaggy, gray-faced sheep from a particularly boggy patch of moorland. Gorok, a man whose worldview was limited primarily to the wool yield of his flock and the exact temperature of his morning gruel, paused, his jaw slackening. Thistle, younger and possessed of a slightly more vivid imagination, dropped his shepherd's crook with a clatter that startled a nearby raven. By the Stone of Whispers, Thistle breathed, his eyes wide. What in the blazes is that? Emerging from the swirling mist, silhouetted against the nascent light of the rising sun, was King Alaric. His crown, glinting with the first golden rays, undeniably proclaimed royalty, yet his attire, a nightshirt of dubious cleanliness, suggested a different narrative entirely. He approached them with the serene confidence of a man inspecting his own property, entirely ignoring the gaping shepherds and their bewildered flock. He paused, indeed, directly in front of the largest and most stubborn sheep, and, with a gentle, paternal expression, reached out a hand to stroke its woolly head. "A fine specimen, my dear fellow," Alaric mumbled, his voice thick with sleep, "though I believe a slight adjustment to the spring shearing schedule might improve overall existential ponderings." The sheep, an animal known for its stoic indifference to human philosophy, merely blinked slowly. Gorok and Thistle, however, exchanged a look of profound, dawning confusion. This was no common madman. This was a yea-crounding madman, and one who spoke with an odd, formal cadence that hinted at noble birth. "Is this a jape, Thistle?" Gorok finally managed, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Are the Duke's players already about, then, for the spring festival? They've certainly outdone themselves with the costume." Thistle shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. "Nay, brother. No jester's crown is that bright, and no actor would brave the bog without proper boots. Look at his feet. He walks as if on air, before they could decide if they should offer the mysterious, crowned sleepwalker some warm milk, or run for the nearest border guard." Alaric, seemingly satisfied with his woolly consultation, continued his onward journey, disappearing once more into the swirling mists, leaving behind only the scent of damp wool and an aura of utter bewilderment. News, however, travels with surprising speed in the Borderlands, carried by startled shepherds, gossiping ravens, and the innate human need for a good, inexplicable story. By the time the sun had fully cleared the horizon, illuminating the Eldorian moors in a pale, indifferent light, word of the crown-clad wanderer of the mists had reached the nearest Eldorian border outpost. A ramshackle collection of timber and stone known, rather optimistically, as Fort Grimfang. Captain Borin Stonehand, the grizzled, perpetually suspicious commander of Fort Grimfang, received the report from a breathless Thistle, with a frown that deepened into a furrow of profound concern. Borin was a man who saw conspiracy in every stray breeze, and an invading army behind every flock of migrating geese. A king in a nightshirt wandering across the border was, to him, not an amusing eccentricity, but a highly sophisticated, and therefore deeply unsettling, act of subterfuge. "A king, you say? From Athelburg?" Borin rumbled, stroking his thick, gray beard. His mind, usually occupied with drills and watch rotations, began to churn with increasingly elaborate theories. "Alone? In a nightshirt? With his crown on?" "Aye, Captain," Thistle insisted, still slightly breathless. "And he spoke to my sheep about existential ponderings. Sounded quite learned, too, despite the lack of trousers." Borin slammed a fist on his rough-hewn table. "Learned? This is it. This is their new tactic. Psychological warfare. They send their monarch, disheveled and seemingly mad, to sow confusion, to demoralize our farmers, to make us question the very fabric of reality before their armored legions sweep across the moors. He paced his small office, his boots thudding ominously. Or perhaps it is a highly elaborate symbolic act of gimmickry, a declaration of war couched in the most insulting possible terms. Our king is so confident in our superiority, they are saying. He can wander into your lands in his sleep, wearing his night clothes, and still conquer your very sensibilities. His second in command, Sergeant Anya, a pragmatic woman whose common sense was often at odds with Boren's dramatic flair, cleared her throat. Captain, with all due respect, perhaps he's merely lost. Or, as the shepherd suggests, a madman. No. Madmen do not wear perfectly polished crowns, Sergeant, and they rarely discuss existential ponderings with livestock. No, this is clearly a highly choreographed piece of Ethelbergian theatrical aggression. The question is, what is his true mission? Is he mapping our bog trails? Is he planting enchanted turnips that will sprout into miniature, loyal Ethelbergian soldiers? Is he counting our sheep for invasion purposes? He pointed a dramatic finger at Thistle. Did he count your sheep, shepherd? Thistle, bewildered, shook his head. No, Captain, he just stroked one, and spoke of shearings. Ah, Borin exclaimed triumphantly. Shearings? He assesses our wool production, a vital component of our military strength. They seek to undermine our textile industries. This is deeper than we thought, Sergeant. This is economic espionage of the highest, most bizarre order. Orders were immediately dispatched. Patrols were sent out, not merely to apprehend the peculiar royal figure, but to observe him, to analyze his movements, to decipher the true meaning of his somnambulistic actions. The Eldorian guards, accustomed to the stern, practical realities of border duty, now found themselves tracking a crowned man in a nightshirt who seemed to be conducting a thorough, if utterly nonsensical, survey of Eldorian agriculture. They found King Alaric some time later, near a small, ancient shrine dedicated to a forgotten Eldorian harvest deity. He was attempting, with an expression of intense concentration, to realign the small, crudely carved wooden idol, mumbling about suboptimal spiritual flow and the need for better ceremonial drainage. He then, to the utter astonishment of the observing Eldorian patrol, produced a single perfectly formed, albeit slightly damp, turnip from his nightshirt pocket and placed it reverently at the idol's base, as if it were a sacrificial offering. The turnip, it was later confirmed, was one of Thistle's. "He's offering tribute," one Eldorian guard whispered, clutching his spear tighter. "A peace offering? Or a curse? Turnips, they say, hold potent magic in Ethelberg." Ethelberg, in reality, regarded turnips as a perfectly ordinary, if somewhat bland, root vegetable. When apprised of the turnip offering, declared it further proof of Ethelberg's cunning. A symbolic gesture. He offers us a turnip, a staple of their peasants, while he secretly assesses our strategic vulnerabilities. We must intercept him, but gently. He's a king, after all, albeit a very peculiar, possibly enchanted one. We do not wish to accidentally start a war by waking him and having him discover he is surrounded by armed Eldorians, while offering a turnip to a pagan god. The Eldorian guards, a mix of hardened warriors and bewildered farmers, thus approached the sleepwalking Alaric with the trepidation usually reserved for encountering ancient, territorial dragons. They observed him from a distance, watching as he meticulously rearranged a small pile of pebbles beside the shrine, seemingly convinced he was constructing a complex siege engine. Meanwhile, behind the Eldorian lines, moving with a stealth born of sheer terror and desperation, were the night sentinels from Ethelberg. They had seen Alaric cross the border, and their hearts had plummeted into their polished boots. They knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that their peculiar, beloved sovereign had just sleepwalked himself into an international quagmire. They observed the Eldorian patrols observing their king, and the tangle of misunderstandings grew deeper, more absurd, and infinitely more dangerous. The stage was set, not for battle, but for a diplomatic incident of truly epic and profoundly comical proportions, all because a king had a particularly active subconscious and a rather sturdy crown. The pale, hesitant light of dawn, which in Ethelberg might have promised dew-kissed meadows and the chirping of optimistic larks, arrived in Eldoria with the stoic grimness of a perpetually overcast Tuesday. It revealed not verdant fields, but a landscape of stark, rolling hills, dotted with clumps of tenacious, gnarled heather and the occasional, particularly bleak boulder. The air carried a biting chill, a dampness that seemed to seep directly into the bones. It was precisely the sort of landscape that bred cynicism and a profound disinterest in anything remotely resembling novelty. And it was into this unyielding vista that King Alaric of Ethelberg, clad only in his crumpled nightshirt and, quite remarkably, his still secure crown, now found himself, his nocturnal journey having delivered him not to a comforting bed, but to the very threshold of profound geopolitical awkwardness. He had, at some point, ceased his purposeful sleepwalk. The exact moment was unclear, even to Alaric himself. One moment he was meticulously inspecting the precise angle of a particularly dew-laden thistle, convinced it held the key to improved crop yields. The next, a profound, bone-deep chill had pierced the nebulous comfort of his slumber, dragging him, groaning faintly, towards a most unwelcome awakening. His eyes, when they finally fluttered open, presented him not with the familiar, comforting shadows of his royal bedchamber, nor the soft, moon-repelling gleam of Master Cuthbert's questionable curtains, but with the unyielding, grey-brown expanse of the Eldorian moor. Above him, the sky was a bruised plum color, threatening rain. Around him, the wind, an unwelcome companion, tugged at his nightshirt with impertinent fingers. And directly in front of him, looming like particularly surly statues carved from disappointment, stood two Eldorian border guards. These were not the broad-shouldered, deferential night sentinels of Ethelberg, who, despite their exhaustion, still held a faint, residual awe for their king. No, these were Eldorian guards, and Eldorian guards, particularly those assigned to the remote, perpetually uninteresting border post of Grimsfield Pass, considered awe a weakness, deference a foreign concept, and novelty a sure sign of impending paperwork. They were, in short, profoundly unimpressed. The first guard, a man named Borin, whose face looked as if it had been carved from the very same unyielding rock as the landscape around him, peered at Alaric with eyes the color of stale pond water. He held a halberd with the casual indifference of a man accustomed to leaning on it, rather than swinging it. His companion, a younger, fidgetier man named Fendrel, whose perpetually runny nose seemed to be his most defining feature, merely blinked repeatedly, a slow, methodical rhythm of incomprehension. They had been debating the exact philosophical implications of a particularly stubborn moss growth on their watchtower, when Alaric had quite literally materialized out of the pre-dawn gloom, looking for all the world like a misplaced chess piece. "And who, pray tell," Borin grunted, his voice a low rumble, "might you be, flailing about on the sovereign soil of Eldoria in naught but your underthings in a rather shiny pot?" He eyed Alaric's crown with a mixture of suspicion and mild disdain. It looked expensive, which only made its current context more irritating. Alaric, his mind still swimming in the murky waters between sleep and a rather humiliating reality, straightened his crown with a dazed, automatic gesture. I am King Alaric," he declared, his voice, normally accustomed to resonating through grand halls, sounding thin and reedy in the biting wind. "King Alaric of Ethelberg. I seem to have Misplaced my kingdom. Borin and Fendrel exchanged a long, pregnant look. A look that conveyed years of shared misery, innumerable sleepless nights, and the collective burden of having encountered every conceivable variety of drunkard, madman, and ill-advised smuggler that the Borderlands had to offer. This, however, was new, even for Grimsfield Pass. Right, Borin said, drawing out the word like a particularly reluctant piece of taffy. And I'm the Emperor of Blistering Barnacles. Fendrel, did you hear that? The King of Ethelberg. Come for morning stroll. Apparently, in his nightgown. Fendrel sniffed. Looks cold, Borin. And wet. Did you see the fog? Might be a trick. Or he's escaped from the asylum again. Remember old Madge who thought she was a turnip? Too much crown for Madge, Borin dismissed. Her delusions were always more root vegetable-based. No, this one's new. A different vintage of Lucy. He poked Alaric gently with the butt of his halberd. You sure you're a king, mate? Because most kings I've heard of usually have, clothes. And an army. Not a nightshirt and a glazed expression. Alaric, now fully awake, but still profoundly disoriented, attempted to assert his authority. I assure you, I am indeed King Alaric. There has been, a misunderstanding. A most regrettable incident involving Luna-activated peptides and an ill-advised Jersey cow, Doughty. He gestured vaguely, as if the entire convoluted explanation of Dr. Oakhaven's diagnosis would somehow make perfect sense to two bewildered Eldorian border guards at dawn. Borin's eyebrows, thick and bristly like neglected broom heads, drew together. Luna activated what now? Listen, King Alaric, we've heard it all. Lost a bet? On a dare? Trying to impress a girl? Because, let me tell you, this isn't exactly charming. This is just inconvenient. I tell you why. And cold. Mostly cold. Fendrel, shivering, piped up. He could be a spy, Borin. A very strange spy. Distraction tactics. Borin scoffed. A spy? In a nightshirt and a crown? What? He's planning to charm our national secrets out of us with tales of his jammies. No, Fendrel. This is either a drunkard who's had a truly monumental night, or some poor sod whose family finally decided to just let him wander off. But he said he's a king, Fendrel insisted, a flicker of concern in his bleary eyes. What if he is? What if this is an act of war? A new kind of, disrobent strategy? Borin sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of all the world's accumulated tedium. Fendrel, if Ethelberg is going to declare war, I reckon they'd send more than one man in his nightshirt. Even if he does have a fancy hat. They'd send, soldiers. With swords. And proper trousers. This is just a nuisance. A very regal nuisance. The debate continued. A quiet, almost domestic squabble played out against the vast, indifferent backdrop of the Eldorian moors. We should arrest him, Fendrel ventured, attempting to sound authoritative. Trespassing. Public indecency, possibly. Loitering with intent to confuse. And then what, Fendrel? Borin countered, gesturing with his halberd towards their small ramshackle guardhouse, which looked less like a fortress and more like a shed that had lost a fight with a particularly aggressive gust of wind. Where are we going to put him? Our cells are for smugglers, not for half-dressed royalty. And the paperwork. Imagine the forms, Fendrel. Nature of infraction, royal sleepwalking, ire, nightshirt and crown, claims to be a monarch, suggested penalty, warm tea and a blanket, pending further identification. But what if he really is King Alaric? Fendrel persisted, a tiny annoying gnat of doubt buzzing in his mind. We can't just leave a king out here in the cold. It's bad for diplomatic relations. Or at least, bad for his health. He looks a bit pale. Alaric, meanwhile, swayed slightly, his attention drawn by a particularly vibrant patch of moss. He reached out a hand, tracing its velvety texture. Remarkable, he murmured, more to himself than to the guards. Such resilience. One might almost say, kingly. Boren watched him, then rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Right. Definitely a few coins short of a royal treasury, this one. Look, Fendrel, here's what we do. We don't touch him. We don't arrest him. We simply observe. This isn't our problem. This is a problem for someone with more stripes on their arm, and a larger budget for baffling incidents. But the protocol, Boren, Fendrel wailed, his voice a whiny protest against the chaotic intrusion of reality into their monotonous routine. Section 7, Paragraph C, any individual making claims of high office or divine appointment, particularly if said claims are made whilst wearing unusual attire, shall be immediately detained for questioning pending verification by a senior officer. Fendrel, Boren said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low growl. Have you ever seen a senior officer out here before midday? They're all tucked up in their barracks, dreaming of warm gruel and not having to deal with this. He waved a hand dismissively at Alaric, who was now attempting to engage a particularly stoic sheep in a silent philosophical discussion. No, Fendrel. We report it. Vaguely, don't we? And we let the next shift deal with it. Or perhaps, if we're lucky, he'll simply wander off again before anyone important arrives. Perhaps he'll wander back to wherever it is he came from. Ethelburg, was it? Sounds like a made-up place anyway. The sun, having finally gathered enough courage, began to peek over the jagged horizon, casting a weak, watery light across the scene. It illuminated King Alaric, standing forlornly on the Eldorian border, his nightshirt flapping in the breeze, his crown glistening mockingly, utterly bewildered by his surroundings. It also illuminated the two Eldorian border guards, Boren and Fendrel, who, despite the momentousness of having a foreign monarch appear on their watch, remained resolutely, profoundly, and hilariously unimpressed. Their main concern, it seemed, was the imminent end of their shift, the promise of lukewarm tea, and the dread of having to fill out an incident report that would surely defy all known categories of bureaucratic classification. The King of Ethelburg, a man now officially in the wrong kingdom, was to them merely a particularly baffling, highly inconvenient speck on their otherwise uneventful and very cold morning. For now he was just a problem to be procrastinated, a curious royal anomaly left to stand in the increasingly harsh Eldorian dawn, a silent testament to the unpredictable nature of sleep, and the even more unpredictable nature of those tasked with guarding the mundane edges of the world. The morning sun, which had promised little more than a persistent chill, had with grudging slowness begun to burn away the last wisps of Eldorian mist. It illuminated King Alaric of Ethelburg, still clad in his disheveled nightshirt and remarkably untarnished crown, standing with the bewildered dignity of a damp heron on the desolate moorland border. Boren and Fendrel, the two border guards, had, after much protracted and philosophical debate concerning the practicalities of arrest warrants for sleepwalking monarchs, reluctantly conceded that leaving a crowned man in his nightgown to the whims of the Eldorian weather might, in the long run, cause more paperwork than simply escorting him to the nearest official holding. This was not out of compassion, mind you, but out of a deep-seated Eldorian aversion to any situation that might escalate beyond a minor inconvenience. It was the arrival of Captain Thistlewick, the grizzled, perpetually unimpressed commander of the Grimsfield Pass garrison, that finally sealed Alaric's fate for the immediate future. Sleepwalked, whose face resembled a particularly well-worn boot, took one look at Alaric, then at Boren and Fendrel, then back at Alaric, and let out a sigh that could have deflated a hot air balloon. A king, you say? In his nightshirt? On my watch? This is precisely why I moved to the border. To avoid this sort of theatrical nonsense from the capital. Get him inside. Give him some porridge. And find out if he's actually a king or just, as I suspect, a particularly elaborate practical joke played by those rapscallions from the Ironwood clan. Thus, King Alaric, still mostly in the dazed, semi-conscious state of someone who has just completed an unsolicited cross-country trek, found himself gently, yet firmly, ushered not back towards Ethelberg, but deeper into Eldoria. His escorts were not his deferential night sentinels, but the aforementioned Captain Thistlewick, Boren, and Fendrel, who treated him less like a sovereign and more like a potentially flammable package. The journey from the Standing Stone to the nearest Eldorian outpost, a sturdy but entirely unregal stone keep known as Thistlewick's Bastion, was short but jarring. Alaric was given a particularly scratchy, unwashed blanket to ward off the chill, which he clutched with the vague discomfort of a man who usually slept on silk. Upon arrival at Thistlewick's Bastion, a place that reeked faintly of damp wool, stale bread, and the grim determination of men who found joy only in the absence of trouble, Alaric was led, not to a gilded chamber, but to a small utilitarian dining hall. The walls were bare stone, the table a single, heavy slab of rough-hewn oak, scarred by countless meals and the occasional impromptu arm-wrestling match. A single, flickering tallow candle on the table cast dancing shadows that did little to dispel the general aura of cheerless efficiency. Captain Thistlewick, after a brief exasperated consultation with his two guards, decided on a course of action. "Right, Your Majesty," he began, his voice dripping with an irony so thick it could be spread on toast. "We'll get you some breakfast. Then we'll figure out what to do with you. And try not to cause any more international incidents with your pajamas." Alaric, by this point, had shaken off the last vestiges of his sleepwalking haze. He looked around him, his royal brow furrowed in a mixture of confusion and burgeoning indignation. This was decidedly not his castle. The scent of burnt porridge and something vaguely metallic hung in the air, a stark contrast to the aroma of freshly baked bread and fine coffee that usually permeated the Ethelbergian royal kitchens. The table was coarse, the bench hard. He missed his comfortable padded breakfast chair. He missed the precise, anticipatory movements of his own servants. He missed above all the familiar, comforting hum of his own kingdom. A stout, severe-faced woman, whose apron seemed to have seen more battles than General Magnus, clattered into the room, bearing the steaming bowl of what appeared to grey gruel. This was Grethel, the cook of Thistlewick's Bastion, a woman whose culinary philosophy could be summarized as sustenance, not pleasure. She placed the bowl before Alaric with a thump that made the candle flicker precariously. "There," she announced, her voice as unyielding as the Eldorian stone itself. "Porridge. Get it down, ye. And don't spill none on that fancy nightshirt." Her gaze lingered on his crown, a flicker of something akin to bewildered amusement in her otherwise stern eyes. Alaric blinked at the bowl. He had not eaten porridge since his childhood, and even then, it was always delicately sweetened with honey from the royal apiaries, and served with a dusting of cinnamon. This grey substance looked suspiciously like something one might use to mend a leaky roof. "My good woman," Alaric began, his voice regaining some of its accustomed regal timbre, even as he was painfully aware of the absurdity of his attire. "While I appreciate the sentiment, this is not precisely what I require for my morning repast. I am King Alaric of Ethelberg, and my breakfast is, by long-standing royal tradition, rather specific. Gretel folded her arms, her expression hardening further, if such a thing were possible. "Oh, is it now? And what? Pray tell. Does a king who wanders the moors in his undies require? We've got porridge. And if you're lucky, a stale piece of hardtack. The larder isn't exactly brimming with royal delicacies out here. Your Majesty?" The last two words were delivered with a snort that could have cleared a blocked chimney. Alaric stiffened. The sheer impertinence. "I require," he stated, drawing himself up as much as one could while seated on a hard bench in a nightshirt, a fresh flaky croissant, still warm from the royal ovens, lightly brushed with melted butter and served with a dollop of our finest cloudberry jam. Accompanying this, I would prefer a precisely 3-minute boiled egg, shelled and presented in an egg cup, alongside 2 slices of crisp fried bacon, not too greasy, mind you. And, most importantly, a tall glass of Jersey cow milk, specifically from the placid breed, chilled, but not so cold as to numb the palate. He paused, a flicker of genuine longing in his eyes, and perhaps for after a small dish of candied violets, a small, delicate touch, but essential for contemplation. The room fell silent. Captain Thistlewick, who had been leaning against a doorframe, slowly straightened, his jaw slack. Borin and Fendrel exchanged another one of their long, silent looks, this one containing a new element of profound disbelief. Gretel, the cook, let out a short, sharp gasp, her face turning a shade of puce usually reserved for overripe plums. "Cloudberry jam?" Gretel shrieked, her voice rising to a crescendo that rattled the rough-hewn table. "Candied violets? And Jersey cow milking? What in the name of the north wind are you talking about, man? We've got wild berries, if you want to brave the brambles. And if you're lucky, the last cow hasn't kicked the bucket yet, but Jersey cow milk. Are you daft, or simply trying to insult my kitchen?" She threw her hands up in exasperation. "We boil roots, we stew game that's mostly gristle, and we make bread so hard you could use it to hammer nails. Croissant? Butter? This isn't some fancy royal tea party, you half-naked lunatic. This is Grimsfield Bastion. Alaric, unaccustomed to such a direct, unvarnished display of outrage, blinked. "Lunatic, I am King Alaric, and these are my established breakfast requirements. Any proper royal kitchen should be able to provide them. It is simply a matter of standard procedure." He gestured vaguely, as if the concept of a multi-course, meticulously prepared breakfast was as universal as breathing. Captain Thistlewick stepped forward, his expression a mixture of grudging respect for Alaric's audacity and burgeoning annoyance. "Look here, Your Majesty. You're in Eldoria now. We eat what's available. And what's available is what Gretel slops into that bowl. We don't have time for fancy pastries and special cow breeds. There are reports to file, borders to guard, and the constant threat of a particularly aggressive badger. Now, are you going to eat that porridge, or are we going to have to consider you a prisoner of war who refuses standard rations?" The implication, however absurd given Alaric's attire, hung heavy in the air. A prisoner of war, because he demanded croissants and Jersey milk. The irony was not lost on Alaric, though he was far too tired and cold to appreciate its finer nuances. "This is utterly preposterous," Alaric protested, a flicker of his waking stubbornness emerging. "I simply wondered. I merely sleepwalked. There was no intent of war, and I have a very sensitive palate. Goat milk, you see, was the issue. Dr. Oakhaven, a most reputable physician, diagnosed Luna-activated peptides. The Jersey cow milk was a crucial part of the cure. At the mention of Dr. Oakhaven's convoluted diagnosis, Borin and Fendrel, who had been lurking in the background suppressing snickers, burst into choked coughs. Even Captain Thistlewick's stern fade wavered slightly. Gretel, however, seemed to transcend mere amusement and move directly to righteous fury. "Luna activated what?" she bellowed, snatching the wooden spoon from the bowl of gruel as if it were a weapon. "Listen here, you fancy-pants dream walker. The only thing activated around here is my temper. We've got real problems, like wolves in the winter and turnips that refuse to grow. We don't have time for your moon nonsense and your milk peculiarities. Eat your porridge, or you'll get nothing but cold air and a lecture on the economic impracticalities of candied violets in a border outpost." The sound of her voice echoed in the small hall. Alaric, for the first time in his life, found himself completely at a loss. He was a king, accustomed to deference, to having his every whim, no matter how specific, met with quiet efficiency. He was not accustomed to being yelled at by a cook wielding a wooden spoon, nor to having his medical conditions ridiculed by gruff, sleep-deprived border guards. The sheer, unyielding pragmatism of Eldoria was a far more formidable force than any invading army. He looked down at the gray gruel. It was thick, lumpy, and entirely unappealing. But the alternative, it seemed, was starvation and an even greater loss of dignity. With a sigh that carried the weight of generations of royal privilege, colliding with a very unyielding reality, Alaric picked up the spoon. He took a small, hesitant spoonful. The taste was as bland as its appearance, but it was warm, and perhaps, just perhaps, it contained enough caloric density to fuel his increasingly complex predicament. He chewed slowly, his gaze distant, envisioning his royal breakfast table, laden with pastries and his precious Jersey milk. The contrast was stark, almost comical. Captain Thistlewick watched him with a hawk-like intensity. "Good," he grunted, a flicker of something that might have been approval or merely relief in his eyes. "Now that we've established the dietary requirements of a sleepwalking, half-dressed monarch, perhaps we can discuss the rather pressing matter of how you intend to explain your presence on Eldorian soil, without triggering a formal diplomatic incident. Because, Your Majesty, while Unshe might find your story of lunar-activated peptides amusing, I rather doubt our king, Gareth the Gruff, would be quite so entertained. He's not known for his sense of humor, especially before he's had his morning ale." Alaric choked slightly on a particularly stubborn lump of porridge. King Gareth the Gruff, a ruler renowned throughout the northern kingdoms for his short temper, his immense beard, and his utter disdain for anything he deemed frivolous or soft. A king, in short, who would likely consider Alaric's current predicament not a matter for sympathy, but a direct affront to Eldorian national pride, or worse, a subtle, highly irritating declaration of war via ludicrous satire and baffling claims of gastrointestinal lunar connections. The breakfast of diplomatic tension had, it seemed, only just begun. The porridge, for all its blandness, suddenly tasted very much like the bitter pill of impending international crisis. He swallowed, forcing the lump down, already dreading the next course in this absurd, accidental invasion. The simple act of eating had never felt so fraught with peril. He longed for the days when his biggest concern was a misplaced scepter or a grape jelly-stained missive. Those were, comparatively, halcyon days of delightful, manageable chaos. This was something else entirely. This was Eldoria. And Eldoria, he was rapidly discovering, had no patience for nonsense, even if that nonsense was delivered by a king in a crown and a nightshirt. He finished the porridge, hoping it would, at least, grant him the strength to face whatever fresh absurdity the Eldorian morning had in store. It was going to be a long day. Chapter 7. The rival king's amusement the morning at Thistlewick's bastion had proceeded from the initial shock of King Alaric's appearance to the strained, silent consumption of his lumpy porridge. Captain Thistlewick, having seen the king reluctantly force down his grey gruel, felt a faint, grudging respect for the man's resilience, or perhaps simply his hunger. But pragmatism, the true, unyielding bedrock of Eldorian existence, dictated that the matter of a foreign monarch, half-dressed and babbling about celestial peptides, could not simply be allowed to linger. It was, undeniably, an incident. And incidents, especially those involving other kingdoms, however peculiar, demanded immediate, if ponderously slow, bureaucratic attention. A messenger, a wiry, perpetually hunched man named Grim, whose primary skill was an uncanny ability to navigate Eldoria's treacherous paths without falling into a bog, was dispatched with a sealed report. This report, penned by Captain Thistlewick himself with an ink-stained quill and many sighs, attempted to capture the essence of the morning's bewildering events. It detailed the discovery of a lone male, claiming to be King Alaric of Athelberg, clad only in a nightshirt and crown, on Eldorian soil. It recounted his preposterous claims regarding sleepwalking, fermented goat milk, lunar-activated peptides, and a particularly placid Jersey cow. It concluded with Thistlewick's recommendation: secure detention, pending further instructions from His Majesty. Thistlewick had wisely omitted the part about the candied violets. Some absurdities, he decided, were best left unwritten. Accustomed to delivering news of border skirmishes, wolf attacks, or the occasional particularly egregious case of turnip rustling, found this particular missive to be exceptionally odd. He squinted at the seal. A crude wax impression of Thistlewick's personal badger crest, and wondered if the captain had finally cracked under the relentless monotony of Grimsfield Pass. Still, a sealed report was a sealed report. He cinched his cloak, mounted his shaggy pony, and disappeared into the relentless Eldorian drizzle, the damp air muffling the pony's hooves as it plodded towards the capital, Stonehaven. Stonehaven, the heart of Eldoria, was not a place of frivolous delights or sun-drenched courtyards. It was a city carved from the very rock of the mountains, grim and formidable, constantly shrouded in a thin veil of mist. Its castle, Stonehaven Keep, was less an architectural marvel and more a brutalist statement of enduring power, designed to repel armies and deter cheerfulness. And at the center of this stern realm sat King Balthazar. King Balthazar was, to be precise, the monarch often referred to with a mixture of fear and grudging respect as King Gareth the Gruff. His given name, Balthazar, was rarely used outside of official documents or by his long-suffering queen, Eleanor, who was widely believed to be the only person in the kingdom capable of eliciting anything softer than a grunt from him. He was a man built like a particularly sturdy oak, with a beard that could have housed a family of small birds, and eyes that held the perpetual glint of suspicion, and an undeniable, if unsettling, intelligence. His sense of humor, as Captain Thistlewick had rightly noted, was not for the faint of heart. It was rather a dark, dry, and often profoundly ironic wit, a quality that Eldorians, being a generally unsentimental people, found surprisingly endearing in their sovereign. He preferred to observe humanity's follies from a slight distance, dissecting them with a sardonic comment rather than engaging in any tiresome displays of emotion. The report from Grimsfield Pass reached King Balthazar mid-morning. Interrupting his customary breakfast of cured boar and sour ale, a meal he considered the peak of Eldorian culinary achievement, his royal scribe, a nervous man named Quill, whose fingers were permanently stained with ink, presented the sealed parchment with trembling hands. "A report, Your Majesty, from Captain Thistlewick at Grimsfield Pass. Urgent, he claims." Balthazar grunted, tearing open the seal with a practiced flick of his thumb, the wax cracking like old bone. His eyes, the color of peat bogs, scanned the cramped script. As he read, a strange transformation began to occur. His usually stern features, which rarely deviated from a fixed expression of vaguely irritated resolve, began to twitch. The corners of his mouth, habitually set in a grim line, began to lift, almost imperceptibly, upwards. A sound, low and rumbling, like distant thunder, emanated from his chest. "Quill," accustomed to the king's reactions to bad news, a slammed fist, a bellowed oath, a sudden demand for more ale waited with bated breath. This was different. This was unexpected. The rumbling grew, and then, to Quill's profound astonishment, King Balthazar, Gareth the Gruff himself, let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. It was not a joyous sound, nor a particularly pleasant one. It was a guttural, almost scornful sound, tinged with a deep, unsettling amusement. He reread a passage, his eye lingering on lunar-activated peptides, and barked again, this time a series of chortles that shook his formidable frame. "A king," Balthazar declared, thumping the parchment onto the table with a meaty hand. "A king, you say? In his nightshirt and crown, demanding croissants and candied violets, blaming his nocturnal ramblings on fermented goat milk and the G-moon." He snorted, then took a long restorative draught of his ale. "By the beard of Odin, Quill, this is rich. This is a story for the ages. Ethelburg sends us their monarch, not with an army, but with a laundry list of dietary demands, and a physician who sounds like he swallowed a dictionary of gibberish." Quill cautiously offered. "Captain Thistlewick suggests immediate detention, Your Majesty, given the implications of a foreign head of state on our soil." Balthazar waved a dismissive hand, spilling a little ale onto the report. "Detention? Pêche de noir. Where's the sport in that? This isn't a common smuggler, Quill. This is a kinging. A king who has clearly suffered some profound and profoundly amusing mental rupture. A king who believes the moon is making him crave breakfast pastries. No, Quill. This requires a more delicate approach." He leaned back in his massive carved chair, his eyes gleaming with a mischievous light that rarely, if ever, graced their depth. "Think of it, Quill. The dignified king of Ethelburg. A kingdom famed for its bland virtues and its utterly predictable monarchs, reduced to a sleep-addled, half-naked, pastry-obsessed wanderer on moor-cold, pragmatic moors. It's glorious. It's magnificent. It's the funniest thing I've heard since the Duke of Northmarch tried to ride a wild boar to a wedding." "So not an act of war, Your Majesty?" Quill ventured, still a little hesitant. "War?" Balthazar scoffed. "What kind of war begins with a man in his pajamas demanding specialized cow's milk? No, this is an act of sheer, unadulterated, glorious absurdity. And I, Balthazar, King of Eldoria, shall not ruin it with dreary diplomatic protocols. We shall, Quill, play along." Quill blinked. "Play along, Your Majesty?" "Precisely," Balthazar said, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. "If he is King Alaric of Athelburg, as he so vehemently claims, then he shall be treated as such, with all the pomp and circumstance due to a visiting monarch. Albeit a visiting monarch who appears to be operating under a rather charming delusion regarding his digestive system and celestial bodies." He paused, a flicker of genuine contemplation entering his eyes. "This Dr. Oakhaven, who speaks of lunar-activated peptides, he sounds like a charlatan of the highest order. Or genius. One never knows with these academic types. We shall invite him. I wish to hear more of these peptides. Perhaps they could be harnessed for Eldorian purposes. Imagine an army of sleepwalking soldiers, utterly immune to the cold, guided by the moon and the lingering effects of goat cheese. It's inspired lunacy." Quill made a mental note. Investigate the possibility of weaponizing fermented goat milk. He also made a mental note to check if his life insurance was up to date. "Bring here," Balthazar commanded, rising from his chair. "Not to the dungeons. Quill, to a guest chamber. A decent one, but not too comfortable. We wouldn't want him to forget the charms of Eldorian hospitality too quickly. Arrange for him to be given proper Eldorian attire, something sturdy and warm. None of that silken finery. And a meal. A proper Eldorian meal. No croissants. No candied violets. Just honest, wholesome, gruff Eldorian fare. Let him experience our culture, our hospitality, our utterly unflappable common sense. He strode towards the window, looking out over the gray, unforgiving landscape. And ensure he's accompanied by guards, of course. Not for his detention, you understand, but for his protection. One wouldn't want our peculiar guest to wander off into a bog before I've had the chance to thoroughly enjoy his presence. A sudden thought struck Quill. Your Majesty, if he is indeed King Alaric, and he demands to return to Ethelberg, what then? Balthazar turned, his grin widening, showing teeth that were perhaps a shade yellower than strictly regal. Oh, he will, Quill, eventually. But not before we've had our fun. This is a rare, unexpected gift from the cosmos. The universe, in its infinite wisdom, has delivered a comical, bewildered king directly to my doorstep. To simply send him back without enjoying the spectacle would be an insult to the very fabric of existence. No, we shall keep him. For a while. We shall observe his lunar-activated peptides and his yearning for cloudberry jam. We shall see if his sleepwalking truly extends to other kingdoms. Perhaps we shall even take bets on his next unconscious destination. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. This will be far more entertaining than another round of chess with the Grand Duke, or another lecture from the Council of Elders on the precise number of sheep that constitute a flock. Gather the court, Quill. Tell them we have a distinguished if somewhat disheveled guest, and inform them that any sniggering must be done discreetly. I want to see the performance, not be distracted by the audience's poor manners. And so, the strange fate of King Alaric, the sleepwalking monarch, was sealed. He would not be arrested as a trespasser, nor dismissed as a lunatic. He would instead become the unwitting star of King Balthazar's own private, highly exclusive comedy. His journey into the wrong kingdom had taken a turn from alarming to utterly farcical, all under the amused, watchful eye of a king who, though gruff and unyielding, possessed a profound, if dark, appreciation for life's most unexpected and peculiar absurdities. Alaric, still recovering from the indignity of Eldorian porridge, remained blissfully unaware that his predicament had just gone from an international incident to a royal entertainment. The stage was set, the audience, albeit small and jaded, was ready, and the principal actor, still in his nightshirt and crown, was about to discover that the harsh landscape of Eldoria held more than just cold winds and sour ale. It also held a king with a very peculiar sense of humor. The quiet hum of Eldoria, usually a monotonous drone, now seemed to possess a faint, almost imperceptible undercurrent of dry, anticipatory laughter. Chapter 8. The court jester's insight the cold, uncompromising light of the Eldorian morning, which had found King Alaric of Athelberg attempting to negotiate with a particularly stoic sheep on the moors, transitioned into a similarly unyielding afternoon within the stone embrace of Stonehaven Keep. Alaric, stripped of his rumpled nightshirt and crown, the latter of which was now, much to his chagrin, safely locked away in a royal storeroom, along with the former, had been provided with a wardrobe befitting an Eldorian commoner. This consisted of a tunic woven from coarse, undyed wool, trousers of similar material that chafed rather horribly, and boots that seemed designed more for traversing rocky scree than for comfortable walking. His crown, he was informed by a grim-faced attendant, thus being secured. He suspected this meant it was being polished, and then put on display as a trophy of Eldorian pragmatism over Ethelburgian eccentricity. He missed the comforting silk of his own garments with a profound and personal ache. King Balthazar, Gareth the Gruff himself, had, as promised, greeted Alaric with a peculiar blend of feigned regal courtesy and thinly veiled amusement. The Eldorian court, A gathering of individuals whose faces seemed carved from granite, and whose expressions varied only between grim determination and grim indifference, observed the interaction with the quiet, watchful intensity of a pack of wolves, assessing a particularly strange lamb. Alaric, despite his discomfiting attire and the lingering taste of unseasoned porridge, attempted to maintain his royal dignity, albeit with the slightly shell-shocked air of a man who had suddenly discovered that the entire universe was, in fact, an elaborate prank. "Welcome, King Alaric of Ethelburg," Balthazar had rumbled, his voice like rocks tumbling down a mountain, a sound that made Alaric instinctively flinch. "A most unexpected pleasure. We hear tales of your kingdom's curious customs, but this takes the crown, does it not?" He punctuated this with a dry chuckle that seemed to crackle in the frigid air of the great hall. The Eldorian courtiers, ever attuned to their king's peculiar humor, offered up a scattering of polite, almost imperceptible coughs that served as their equivalent of laughter. Alaric, bristling slightly, attempted to explain. "Your Majesty, there has been a profound misunderstanding. My presence here is entirely accidental, a matter of somnambulism. And as my royal physician, Dr. Oakhaven, would explain, lunar-activated peptides. The goat milk, you see, was most unfortunate." Balthazar merely raised a bushy eyebrow, a gesture that conveyed skepticism, amusement, and a complete lack of interest in the intricacies of Ethelburgian medical theory. "Lunar-activated peptides," he repeated slowly, tasting the words as if they were a particularly unpalatable root. "Indeed. A most original explanation for a midnight stroll into a foreign kingdom. My own physicians, I assure you, merely prescribe a strong draught of ale and a firm smack to the head for such wanderings." The Eldorian courtiers offered another round of barely audible coughs, some even venturing a slight twitch of the lips. And so King Alaric became, for King Balthazar and his court, a source of endless quiet entertainment. He was given a seat at the main table, always positioned where Balthazar could observe him. He was fed Eldorian fare stews of unidentifiable meat, bread harder than a blacksmith's anvil, and ale so sour it curdled the insides, and he was expected to participate in the general grim pleasantries of the Eldorian court. His attempts to explain his sleepwalking were met with polite nods that masked profound disbelief, and his longing for croissants and Jersey milk became a running joke, whispered with surprising speed throughout Stonehaven Keep. Among the Eldorian court, amidst the stony faces and the gruff pronouncements, there was only one individual who seemed to genuinely grasp the bizarre, yet entirely plausible nature of King Alaric's predicament. This was Pip, the royal jester. Pip was a slight, wiry man, whose age was impossible to discern, for his face was a canvas of wrinkles, some from age, many more from a lifetime of suppressed mirth. He wore motley clothes of faded greens and browns, adorned with bells that rarely jingled, for Pip moved with the quiet grace of a shadow. His wit was as sharp and unexpected as a shard of flint, and while he was often overlooked as mere entertainment, his observations were frequently far more insightful than those of the most esteemed advisers. He was the only one in Eldoria who had truly listened to Alaric's bewildered claims, his mind unburdened by the need for conventional logic, piecing together the fragmented truths within the absurdities. Pip had a particular fondness for riddles, a means of communication that allowed him to speak uncomfortable truths under the guise of foolishness. He saw the truth of Alaric's situation, not as a cunning invasion or a fit of madness, but as a genuine peculiar accident. And he saw the profound, almost tragicomic irony of a king so utterly unaware of his own nocturnal adventures, yet so convinced of his waking dignity. During the evening meal, as Alaric choked down another spoonful of Eldorian stew, and Balthazar watched him with a flicker of cruel amusement in his eyes, Pip silently approached the high table. He bowed with a flourish that made no sound, his bells refusing to cooperate. "Your Majesty," Pip addressed Balthazar, his voice a reedy whisper that nevertheless carried across the silent hall. "And to our esteemed guest, a riddle, if I may, to enliven this most digestible of evenings." Balthazar grunted. "Speak, Pip, if it is short, and not entirely devoid of wit." Pip turned his gaze to Alaric, a flicker of something akin to sympathy in his ancient eyes. "I wear a crown, yet rule no waking hour. I walk through walls, unseen, without true power. My path is guided by a silver gleam, a fermenting secret in a waking dream. What am I?" The Eldorian courtiers looked at each other, then back at Pip, a collective shrug of incomprehension rippling through their ranks. They were accustomed to Pip's riddles, but they rarely bothered to solve them, preferring to simply appreciate the fact that he was, at least, not singing. Balthazar chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "A phantom, perhaps, or a particularly ambitious moth." He glanced at Alaric, a knowing smirk on his face. "Perhaps our esteemed guest can unravel this profound mystery." Alaric, still trying to dislodge a particularly fibrous piece of root from between his teeth, merely blinked. "A moth? I assure you, I am no moth, and I rule for many waking hours. Though, admittedly, my recent hours have been rather disorienting." He missed the point entirely, caught up in the literal interpretation. Pip's smile did not waver. He simply moved on, his gaze still fixed on Alaric. "I leave my bed, though not my mind. I seek the borders that I may find. My physician warns of a moon's bright curse, and a creature's milk for better or worse. What am I? A wanderer unbound." Again, the Eldorian court met the riddle with a wall of blank faces. General Grimbold, the head of Balthazar's army, snorted. "A lunatic, surely. One who has had too much bad ale." Balthazar raised a hand. No, Grimbold. This is too specific for a common lunatic. It speaks of dairy and celestial bodies. Tell us, King Alaric, do these perplexing queries resonate with your unique condition?" Alaric, now slightly more alert, caught the mention of milk and moon. "Ah! The moon. And the goat milk, of course." Dr. Oakhaven was most emphatic. "Though now I am on Jersey cow milk, which is, admittedly, rather bland. But the curtains, you see, were meant to repel the lunar emanations. Yet, I still found myself here." He gestured around the grim hall, as if his current location was merely an unfortunate side effect of insufficient curtain-repelling power. He still hadn't grasped that the riddle was via by him. Pip, unperturbed, offered another. "I pass through gates, though no guard sees. I climb high towers with effortless ease. My royal advisors fret, my guards despair, as I seek adventures in my sleep bare. What elusive spirit roams thus free? This one?" Even Balthazar's hardened courtiers found vaguely unsettling. It hinted at a certain uncanny ability, a spectral quality. "A ghost?" offered one of the younger, less jaded lords, a nervous tremor in his voice. "A particularly mischievous sprite, perhaps?" suggested another. Balthazar, however, merely stroked his beard, a glint in his eyes. "Barre, you say?" "Ah, yes." Our esteemed guest arrived with a rather minimal wardrobe. "Tell me, King Alaric, do you often find yourself scaling towers in your sleep? Perhaps inspecting the gargoyles for structural integrity?" Alaric, a faint blush creeping up his neck, looked uncomfortable. I have been informed of such incidents, Your Majesty, though I have no recollection. One particularly embarrassing occasion involved a stone fountain and some cherubs." He shuddered at the memory. Pip offered a final, more pointed riddle, his voice now carrying a subtle note of urgency, almost an appeal. "My kingdom seeks me, frantic and sore. My true destination, I know not for sure. I wear a nightshirt and a crown astray, and now I breakfast in a foreign way. Who am I, who lost his own domain? This one was too close, too direct. Even Balthazar's amusement wavered. The courtiers exchanged nervous glances. The implication was clear, even if the Eldorians preferred to interpret it as a clever jester's act, a playful jab at their unusual guest. Balthazar, recovering his sardonic composure, leaned back. Poor, deluded soul Pip, who perhaps ate too much cheese before bed. Or, as our guest insists, a victim of unruly goat milk. A king, it seems, who has wandered from his rightful place. But tell me, Pip, what is the answer to this final, most personal of your perplexing questions? Pip bowed low, his eyes fixed on Alaric, a look of profound, almost sorrowful understanding in their depths. The answer, your majesty, is a king. A king, lost not to war or to famine, but to the gentle, unyielding pull of his own slumber. A king who dreams of distant shores and wakes upon a foreign floor. He straightened, and for a moment the silence in the great hall was profound. It was a silence filled with the unspoken truth. Hovering just beneath the surface of the Eldorian's grim practicality and Balthazar's dark amusement. They chose, however, to interpret it as a particularly poignant poetic flourish. Balthazar grunted in approval. A fine riddle, Pip, and a fine answer. Though I still prefer a man who needs a keeper and a good, strong rope. But yours has a certain dramatic flair. Now, as for our guest, King Alaric, who it seems embodies the very spirit of your riddles, he will remain with us for a while. We have much to discuss, especially regarding the potential for harnessing these lunar-activated peptides for our own purposes. He gave a predatory smile. Alaric, still entirely oblivious to the fact that the jester had just described his entire life story, merely nodded. He had grown accustomed to the Eldorian court's general lack of comprehension. He focused instead on the faint, metallic aftertaste of the stew, and the growing ache in his stomach. He missed his delicate, precise breakfasts with a passion that bordered on patriotic longing. He missed the comforting, if baffling, presence of Dr. Oakhaven and his strange theories. He even missed Master Cuthbert's perpetually sighing presence, and the moon-repelling curtains. Anything was better than this stark, humorless reality, where the only one who seemed to understand him spoke in riddles that no one bothered to solve. The jester, Pip, the quiet, wise observer, turned and slipped away, his bells remaining stubbornly silent, leaving King Alaric to ponder the peculiar fate that had led him, crowned and confused, into a kingdom where truth was often disguised as folly, and folly, in the hands of a gruff king, became the most potent form of entertainment. The Eldorian night closed in, cold and damp, holding the secrets of one king's sleep and another's grim amusement. Chapter 9. The royal nap interrupted the sleep that claimed King Alaric after his unpalatable Eldorian breakfast was not the profound, dream-laden slumber of his own comfortable bed, nor even the vaguely unsettling sleep he experienced under the moon-repelling curtains in Ethelberg. It was rather the heavy, uncomfortable sleep of exhaustion. A profound physical and mental collapse born of an unprecedented nocturnal trek and the subsequent shock of Eldorian hospitality. He had been given a small, unadorned room off the main hall, furnished with a narrow cot that offered little more comfort than a slab of chilled stone. The coarse wool of his borrowed tunic scratched at his skin, and the air, thick with the smell of damp earth and stale ale, was far from the lavender-scented freshness of his royal chambers. His dreams, consequently, were a chaotic mange of lumpy porridge, galloping sheep, and the disembodied voice of Dr. Oakhaven droning on about peptides. The awakening was not a gentle, leisurely process, as was his royal custom, initiated by the soft rustle of silken robes and the discreet clearing of a page's throat. No, Undecided, until kein tun küssen. Necessar. Dies. Alaric's consciousness was abruptly and violently wrenched from its depths by a sound that was utterly foreign and profoundly irritating. A loud, resonant clang, followed by a series of sharp, guttural shouts. It was the sound of metal on metal, of heavy boots on stone, and of voices raised in what sounded suspiciously like disagreement. His head throbbed. A sharp, persistent chill, far beyond the mere dampness of the room, had seeped into his bones, leaving him shivering. He groaned, attempting to burrow deeper into the scratchy blanket, seeking the elusive warmth and quiet of his own bed. But the cot was too short, the blanket too thin, and the cacophony outside his door refused to abate. With a sigh that spoke of profound resignation, Alaric's eyelids fluttered open. The first thing he registered was not the familiar, comforting canopy of his own royal bed, nor the intricate carvings of his Athelbergian bedchamber ceiling. Instead, his eyes fixed on a high, vaulted ceiling of rough-hewn stone, crisscrossed with dark, smoke-stained timbers. The light filtering in was not the soft, diffused glow of Ethelberg's stained-glass windows, but a stark, cold illumination from high, narrow slits that served as windows, admitting little more than the perpetually gray Eldorian sky. The air, he noted, carried a distinct tang of iron, and something vaguely reminiscent of a very old, very damp dog. He sat up, pushing the scratchy blanket aside, and discovered, with a fresh surge of indignation, that he was still clad in the abrasive Eldorian wool. His crown, the symbol of his very being, was nowhere to be seen. A wave of profound disorientation washed over him, a disorienting haze that was only slowly, reluctantly beginning to lift. He remembered the Moors, the gruff guards, the incomprehensible breakfast, the unsettling riddles of the Eldorian Jester. And then he remembered the terrifying realization that he was no longer in Ethelberg. Before he could properly gather his thoughts, before he could fully process the indignity of his current wardrobe, the heavy, studded oak door of his small room creaked open. A particularly burly Eldorian guard, whose face was even more craggy than Borin's, gestured impatiently with a thick, callous thumb. "Up, your majesty. King Balthazar expects your presence. And try not to drip porridge on the floor this time." Alaric, now fully awake and seething with a mixture of confusion and outrage, pushed himself to his feet. "King Balthazar," he spluttered, his voice thin with indignation. "And what precisely is the meaning of this? Where is my crown? Where are my advisors? And why am I dressed as if I've spent a week wrestling a particularly stubborn goat?" The guard merely grunted, utterly unimpressed. "Questions for King Balthazar, your majesty. He's got more than enough answers for all of us. Now, move." Thus, Alaric, feeling utterly undone and profoundly ill-used, was ushered through a series of cold, echoing corridors. The Eldorian castle was a bewildering maze of unadorned stone and grim functionality. There were no tapestries, no gilded statues, no polished marble floors that would have offered a soothing reflection of his royal personage. Every surface was rough, every corner stark, every step a reminder of the utterly joyless practicality of this foreign land. The clanging and shouting grew louder as they approached a massive, double-leaved door, guarded by two more formidable Eldorian soldiers, their faces as unyielding as the stone walls themselves. The door swung open with a resounding thud, revealing not the intimate wood-paneled audience chamber of Athelberg, but a vast, cavernous throne room that seemed carved directly from the living rock of the mountain. It was a place of imposing, brutal majesty. The throne itself was a crude, colossal chair hewn from dark, unpolished granite, upon which sat King Balthazar. Gareth the Gruff, his enormous beard cascading down his chest like a frozen waterfall. He was flanked by his advisors and generals, a collection of equally grim-faced individuals, their expressions ranging from utter boredom to barely concealed irritation. Below them, scattered through the vast hall, were various members of the Eldorian court, clad in their own muted, practical woolens, their faces as unexpressive as the boulders outside. And there, in the very center of this austere assembly, directly beneath the cold, unblinking gaze of King Balthazar, stood a small, round stool. Alaric, in his rough Eldorian tunic and chafing trousers, was unceremoniously directed to perch upon it. He looked, to his utter humiliation, like a particularly disheveled and misplaced gnome. The moment he was seated, the scattered murmuring of the court died. The silence that descended was absolute, heavy, and utterly unnerving. All eyes in the cavernous hall were fixed on him. King Alaric, who had always commanded respect, found himself regarded with a mixture of detached curiosity, impatient annoyance, and, from King Balthazar's own eyes, a glint of undeniable, almost predatory amusement. "Ah, our esteemed guest," Balthazar rumbled, his voice echoing through the vast space. "Awake at last. I trust your slumber was invigorating." The word invigorating was delivered with a sarcasm so dry it could have turned the Eldorian landscape into dust. Alaric, despite the chilling stares and the uncomfortable stool, straightened his back, attempting to project an air of regal authority. "Invigorating, Your Majesty?" he retorted, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed indignation. "I was subjected to a cot that felt as if it were stuffed with rocks, dressed in clothes that chafe, and then rudely awakened by a cacophony that would dislodge the sleep from a hibernating badger. This is hardly the treatment befitting a monarch, even one who has, through unforeseen and entirely accidental circumstances, found himself temporarily mislaid." A ripple, almost imperceptible, passed through the Eldorian court. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others, particularly the gruffer generals, merely narrowed their eyes. King Balthazar, however, merely stroked his formidable beard, his lips twitching. "Mislaid, you say?" Balthazar mused, his voice dangerously soft. A most quaint turn of phrase for an apparent act of uninvited royal intrusion upon sovereign Eldorian soil. "You still insist, I presume, on this fantastical tale of somnambulism, and these lunar-activated peptides?" Alaric bristled. "It is no tale, Your Majesty. It is a medical fact, scientifically observed and painstakingly diagnosed by Dr. Phineas O'Cavan, my esteemed royal physician. The consumption of fermented goat milk, in conjunction with the waxing gibbous moon, creates a gaseous byproduct that influences the cerebellum, prompting an irresistible urge to wander. We even installed moon-repelling curtains." He waved his hands in exasperation, forgetting that the Eldorians had no concept of his Athelbergian problems. A few more of the Eldorian courtiers coughed discreetly, struggling to suppress outright laughter. General Grinbolt, standing near Balthazar's throne, snorted audibly. "Moon-repelling curtains," Balthazar repeated slowly, savoring the words. "And a gaseous byproduct. Remarkable. And you claim to be King Alaric of Athelberg, a kingdom that employs physicians who attribute royal perambulations to flatulence and the lunar cycle?" He paused, his eyes fixed on Alaric. "Athelberg is known, if it is known at all, for its dullness, its predictable harvest reports, and its exceedingly bland cheese. Not for its kings who wander the moors in their nightshirts, blaming celestial interference." Alaric rose from the stool, his indignation finally overcoming his discomfort. "I am King Alaric, and my kingdom is a paragon of quiet virtue and organized tranquility. Our cheeses are renowned for their delicate notes, not their blandness. And as for my nocturnal habits, they are a deeply personal, albeit publicly inconvenient matter. I demand that you release me, and return my crown, and my proper clothes, and arrange for my immediate escort back to Athelberg." His voice, normally so measured and calm, rose to a near shriek. The silence that followed was even more profound than before. The Eldorian court, unaccustomed to such a direct, impassioned, and utterly undignified display from a supposed monarch, simply stared. Their expressions ranged from blank incomprehension to mild offense. To them this was not a king, but a madman, or perhaps a particularly committed actor. King Balthazar, however, merely leaned forward on his granite throne, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Demands, King Alaric?" He rumbled, the amusement clear in his voice. "You are in Eldoria. Here, we do not entertain demands from men who wander into our lands in their underthings, babbling about celestial gases and special cow milk. Dortdoin deliciously. Ace. We entertain them for their sheer theatrical value, perhaps, but we do not take their demands seriously." He gestured to the guards. "Our guest here has enjoyed our breakfast, sampled our finest wool, and now, it seems, has graced us with a performance of his royal tantrums. But the hour grows late. We have matters of state to attend to. Matters concerning genuine threats, I might add, not peculiar forms of sleepwalking." Just then Pip, the court jester, who had been lurking in the shadows near the back of the hall, unseen by most, stepped forward. His bells, for once, jingled faintly, a soft, almost mournful sound in the vast, silent hall. He bowed to Balthazar, then to Alaric, his ancient eyes holding a flicker of something akin to pity. "Your Majesty," Pip addressed Balthazar, his voice a reedy whisper, "and our esteemed guest. Perhaps a final riddle, before the day's serious business commences. A query for the waking mind, though born of a somnolent journey." Balthazar, intrigued, waved a hand. "Speak, Pip. Let us see if your foolishness can cut through the peculiar claims of our guest." Pip turned to Alaric, his gaze knowing. "I rise from sleep in a place unknown. My crown is missing, my comfort overthrown. I speak of home, of duties and grace, but my words fall flat in this barren place. Who am I, truly, in this waking plight?" Alaric stared bewildered at the jester. He understood the words, but not their intent. He was too consumed by his own mounting frustration and confusion to grasp the deeper meaning, the compassionate irony hidden within the seemingly nonsensical words. Balthazar chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "He knows not, Pip, for he is too busy demanding croissants and blaming the moon. The answer, of course, is a fool who mistakes a foreign land for his own chamber pot." Pip merely bowed, his face unreadable. He knew the answer. And he knew Alaric did too in his heart of hearts, even if his waking mind could not yet admit it. The answer was King Alaric himself. "Indeed," Alaric interjected, oblivious to the jab. "A fool would be the one to keep a king against his will and deny him his breakfast. I assure you, King Balthazar, Ethelberg will hear of this. My Lord Chancellor Fitzwilliam, my General Magnus, they will not stand for such an affront." Balthazar merely leaned back, his eyes gleaming. "Let them hear, King Alaric. Perhaps they will send an army of sleepwalkers to rescue you. Or perhaps they will send a particularly strong physician to explain the precise nature of your cranial gases. Either way, it promises to be most entertaining." He paused. Then his voice hardened, losing all trace of amusement. "Until then, you will remain here, as our distinguished guest, and you will conduct yourself with what little dignity your current predicament allows. Understand?" Alaric, finally silenced by the sheer, unyielding force of Balthazar's authority, could only nod, a profound sense of despair settling over him. He was trapped in a strange kingdom, clad in scratchy wool, forced to eat abominable food, and regarded as a source of grim entertainment by a gruff, amused monarch. His crown was gone. His world had been turned upside down. The royal nap had indeed been interrupted, not by the gentle dawn of Ethelberg, but by the jarring, unyielding reality of Eldoria. He was King Alaric, and he was profoundly, undeniably, spectacularly in the wrong place. And the day, he suspected, was only just beginning its long, bewildering course. Chapter 10. The awkward explanation, the raw, unyielding silence of the Eldorian throne room, broken only by the occasional shift of a heavily armored foot or the faint, almost imperceptible tremor of King Alaric's chin, stretched out as a bowstring. Alaric, perched uncomfortably on his small, undignified stool, felt the collective weight of every grim Eldorian gaze upon him. Every grim Eldorian gaze upon him. The cold, unblinking eyes of King Balthazar, seated on his colossal granite throne, were the heaviest of all, drilling into him with a mixture of detached assessment and simmering, deeply unsettling amusement. He was a specimen under observation, a curious, bewildered beetle caught in a particularly austere jar. The humiliation of his borrowed scratchy wool, the memory of the lumpy porridge, and the gnawing ache for his rightful crown coalesced into a potent brew of desperate indignation. He had demanded explanations, and now, it seemed, he was expected to provide one, a task made infinitely more challenging by the profound skepticism radiating from every stone and every unsmiling face in the vast hall. King Alaric cleared his throat, a small, rather pathetic sound that seemed to vanish instantly into the cavernous space. "Your Majesty," he began, attempting to imbue his voice with the gravity and authority befitting a king, even one in such a profoundly undignified predicament. "I understand that my presence here in these most functional surroundings is perplexing, and my attire, I concede, is not precisely that of a head of state on a diplomatic visit. However, I assure you, my appearance here is not an act of aggression, nor an elaborate jest, but rather the unfortunate culmination of a deeply rooted and scientifically perplexing nocturnal habit." Balthazar merely grunted, a low, rumbling sound that could have been agreement, or merely the shifting of a particularly dense rock. His expression remained unreadable, though Alaric detected a faint twitch at the corner of his lips, a precursor, perhaps, to the sardonic amusement he had glimpsed earlier. "You see," Alaric continued, gathering what little composure remained, "for many years now I, King Alaric of Athelberg, have suffered from what my royal physician, Dr. Phineas Oakhaven, refers to as somnambulistic peregrinations. In simpler terms, I walk in my sleep. Not merely a few steps, mind you, or a brief visit to the royal larder for a midnight snack, but rather quite extensive journeys." He paused, hoping for a sign of understanding, but met only the unyielding stares of the Eldorian court. "Indeed," Balthazar drawled, his voice slow and deliberate, "we have heard whisperings of your, shall we say, spirited, nocturnal ambles." Captain Thistlewick's report was quite descriptive, particularly concerning the heirloom chamber pot and the farmer's wife. A most peculiar diplomatic exchange, I must say. A few of the Eldorian generals exchanged a glance. A slight lifting of a bushy eyebrow here, a brief, almost imperceptible nod there, indicating that this particular detail had indeed circulated. Alaric felt a fresh wave of heat rise to his face. "That incident," he said, stumbling over the words, "was particularly regrettable. But it was, alas, entirely beyond my conscious control. My waking self remembers nothing of these excursions. It is as if a separate entity, a nocturnal self, takes charge. A self that, I am reliably informed, possesses an uncanny ability to navigate complex environments, scale walls, and apparently barter royal artifacts for vegetables." He sighed, a profound, weary sound. "My guards, bless their souls, have been driven to the brink of despair. My Lord Chancellor Fitzwilliam has aged decades trying to implement a nocturnal sovereign retrieval protocol that consistently fails. Balthazar leaned forward, placing his massive forearms on the stone armrests of his throne. And this, Dr. Oakhaven? He probed, his voice laced with an almost eager curiosity. He has a diagnosis for this rather unique royal affliction. What grand medical theory explains a king trading his chamber pot for a turnip? Alaric, now plunging into the perilous depths of Dr. Oakhaven's pseudo-scientific jargon, felt a faint tremor of dread. Ah, yes, Dr. Oakhaven. A truly brilliant mind, though perhaps a trifle unorthodox. His diagnosis is both complex and, he insists, utterly irrefutable. It concerns, Your Majesty, the peculiar interaction between fermented goat milk and the waxing gibbous moon. A beat of absolute silence descended upon the throne room. Ah, not even a cough, not a rustle. Then, from somewhere deep in Balthazar's chest, a low rumble began. It started softly, like stones grinding together, then escalated, growing in volume, until it burst forth as a full, unrestrained peal of laughter. It was not a pleasant sound. It was guttural, harsh, and utterly devoid of warmth, the kind of laughter that could chip paint from the walls. Balthazar threw his head back, his enormous beard shaking, his booming mirth echoing through the stone hole. Fermented goat milk. Balthazar roared, wiping a tear from the corner of his eye. And the moon. By the beard of Elder, this is even better than the reports suggested. You blame your nocturnal wanderings, King Alaric, on day-gary products and day-celestial bodies. He slapped his knee with a resounding thwack. Tell me more. I must hear the full glorious details of this Athelbergian medical marvel. Alaric, despite the humiliation, forced himself to continue. This was his truth, however absurd. Precisely, Your Majesty. Dr. Oakhaven discovered that the milk from our particular strain of Ethelbergian grey-horned goats contains what he termed somnambulistic peptides. These peptides, innocuous in isolation, when exposed to the atmospheric pressures and gravitational pull of a waxing gibbous or full moon, undergo a subtle, yet potent, fermentation within the royal digestive tract. He spoke with the earnestness of a scholar, utterly oblivious to the Eldorian court, who now stared at him with a mixture of open-mouthed astonishment and incredulous disbelief. Even General Grimbold, whose face was usually impervious to emotion, looked utterly bewildered. Balthazar, still chuckling, gestured with a dismissive hand. The digestive tract, you say? So, in essence, you're suggesting that your royal bowels are conspiring with the moon to send you on midnight excursions? He choked on another wave of laughter. This is exquisite. My own court, when faced with a common case of indigestion, usually blames the ale, never the moon. No, Your Majesty, not merely the bowels. Alaric protested, warming to the subject in his desperation to be understood. The internal fermentation, you see, creates a unique gaseous byproduct, an ethereal vapor, Dr. Oakhaven called it, which then rises directly to the cranial cavity, influencing the delicate dendrites of the cerebellum. He gestured vaguely to his head, then to his stomach, trying to illustrate the bizarre internal journey. The cerebellum, which governs balance and coordinated movement, enters a heightened state of paradoxical nocturnal activation. It compels me to move, to explore, to perambulate. General Grimbold, unable to contain himself, let out a loud snort. So, the king is gassy, he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. A few suppressed giggles rippled through the court. Balthazar, wiping his eyes, waved a hand at Grimbold. Silence, Grimbold. We are in the presence of Ethelbergian medical science. It is a noble gas, not mere flatulence. A noble gas, apparently, with a penchant for chamber pots and turnips. He roared with laughter again, thumping his throne. Remarkable. Truly, truly remarkable. Alaric, trying to regain some semblance of dignity, pressed on. We attempted to mitigate the issue, Your Majesty. Firstly, I was forbidden all goat milk, and prescribed the milk of a specially bred, exceptionally placid Jersey cow, known for its calming, non-peptidic properties. Ah, the cow milk! Balthazar exclaimed, a fresh wave of amusement washing over him. The report mentioned a cow. And what of the second part of this ingenious cure? Did your esteemed physician recommend leeches? Or perhaps a lobotomy? No, Your Majesty, Alaric said, taking a deep breath. The second part involved the installation of moon-repelling curtains in my bedchamber. Crafted from the finest, darkest velvet, woven with threads of silver, as Dr. Oakhaven explained, having a natural antipathy to lunar emanations and imbued with a faint scent of garlic and rosemary, known for their warding properties against errant nocturnal energies. These curtains, when drawn, were meant to create a hermetically sealed lunar nullification zone around my bed, preventing the peptides from reaching their full somnambulistic potential. This pronouncement, delivered with such earnest solemnity, proved too much for the Eldorian court. A collective groan, bordering on a stifled chorus of incredulous snorts, swept through the hall. Even the most stoic Eldorians struggled to maintain their composure. General Grimbold openly slapped his knee, his shoulders shaking with silent, mirthless laughter. Balthazar, however, did not just laugh. He threw his head back and let loose a thunderous, unrestrained bellow of pure, unadulterated hilarity that seemed to shake the very foundations of Stonehaven Keep. Tears streamed down his face, his beard trembled, and he pounded his fists on the arms of his throne. Moon-repelling curtains, he gasped, barely able to speak. Garlic-scented, and a lunar nullification zone. By the ancestors, King Alaric, your kingdom is a veritable fount of comedic genius. You are not a king, sir. You are a performance. A magnificent, unwitting performance. He leaned forward, his eyes still brimming with mirth. So, tell me, King Alaric, if these magnificent curtains and this placid cow milk were so effective, how precisely did you find yourself, crown and nightshirt and all, several leagues from your esteemed Ethelberg, on your bleak and utterly moon-unaffected moorland? Alaric's face, which had been flushed with embarrassment, now paled. He had reached the crux of his predicament, the undeniable, baffling failure of Dr. Oakhaven's otherwise brilliant diagnosis. Well, he stammered, that is the most perplexing part. Despite all precautions, despite the absolute darkness of the curtains, despite the Jersey cow milk, I awoke on the moors. Apparently, I scaled the curtains, and then the castle walls, and then the main gate, and then he trailed off, the memory of his precarious rooftop traverse, his descent down the crumbling wall, and his general effortless breach of all known security measures, suddenly seeming even more impossible and humiliating, now that he was fully awake and confronted by a skeptical audience. It appears my somnambulistic self found an entirely unprecedented escape route, one that defied the lunar nullification zone. Balthazar roared with laughter again, leaning back against his throne, completely overcome. So, your sleeping self is more cunning than your waking self, more determined than your own royal guards. He scales walls, bypasses gates, and shrugs off moon-repelling curtains. This is not a medical condition, King Alaric. This is a secret weapon, an unseen, night-shirted infiltrator. Perhaps we should be paying you for this entertainment. Or perhaps we should be hiring your Dr. Oakhaven to design defenses that your enemies might wander through. The Eldorian court, emboldened by their king's open amusement, now permitted themselves outright chuckles, some even pointing discreetly at Alaric. The unfortunate king felt his dignity, already threadbare, disintegrate completely. He was a laughingstock, a royal buffoon whose private affliction had become a public spectacle in a foreign land. His painstaking explanation, a desperate attempt to restore some semblance of sense to his predicament, had only served to fuel Balthazar's grim, Eldorian humor. Pip, the court jester, still lurking in the shadows, watched the scene unfold. His bells remained silent, but a faint, knowing smile played on his lips. He alone understood the profound tragedy within the farce. A king, utterly adrift from his own reality, desperately trying to impose logic on an illogical situation, only to be met with mockery. He saw the irony of Alaric's meticulous, if absurd, explanation, and the crude, unyielding practicality of Balthazar's amusement. The gap between Athelberg and Eldoria was not merely geographical. It was a chasm of understanding, a fundamental disagreement on the very nature of reality. And King Alaric, the sleepwalking monarch, was precisely in the middle of it, utterly lost, and profoundly, hilariously out of place. He sighed, a sound swallowed by the stone walls. It was going to be a very long visit. Chapter 11. The proposal of mutual benefit, the echoes of King Balthazar's uproarious laughter, like stones tumbling down a particularly steep ravine, gradually subsided, leaving the vast, echoing throne room of Stonehaven keep in a state of brittle silence. King Alaric, still perched precariously on his undignified stool, felt every nerve in his body vibrate with a potent mixture of mortification and simmering outrage. His earnest, albeit convoluted, explanation of lunar-activated peptides and moon-repelling curtains had not, it seemed, been met with the understanding he craved, but rather with a fresh torrent of Eldorian ridicule. His dignity, already clinging by a single, fraying thread, had now been utterly shredded, scattered like chaff before a gale. He was not a respected monarch, but a comedic spectacle, an unwitting performance for a grim-faced audience and a gruff, amused king. King Balthazar, having recovered his breath and wiped the tears of mirth from his eyes, leaned forward on his granite throne. The amusement, though still present, now receded, replaced by a shrewd, calculating glint in his peat-bog eyes. He regarded Alaric with a renewed intensity, as if seeing him not merely as a source of entertainment, but as an unexpected, peculiar opportunity. "My dear King Alaric," he began, his voice still containing a faint tremor of suppressed mirth, but now edged with a more serious, almost predatory tone. "Your predicament is, as you have so eloquently, if bafflingly, explained, unique, unprecedented even. A king, seemingly immune to locks, guards, and even the most potent of garlic-scented moon nullification zones, driven by an invisible internal urge to wander beyond his borders. One might almost call it a gift." Alaric blinked, utterly confused. "A gift, Your Majesty? I assure you, it is anything but. It is a chronic inconvenience, a source of constant anxiety for my court, and now, apparently, a direct route to profound humiliation." "Precisely," Balthazar boomed, slapping the armrest of his throne, the sound reverberating through the hall. "An inconvenience for Jew, perhaps, but for Gius, an intriguing new variable in the delicate dance of international relations. Consider, King Alaric, the potential. Imagine, if you will, the implications if your nocturnal self, in its quest for pastures new, were to stumble into a truly hostile territory. Or, worse, were to be found attempting to milk a particularly sacred war beast of the northern clans. The diplomatic fallout, the inevitable skirmishes, the sheer, unadulterated paperworking." He shuddered, a theatrical gesture that was both genuine and designed for effect. Alaric, despite his ongoing misery, found himself nodding. The hypothetical scenario Balthazar painted was, to his mind, Entirely plausible, and indeed, terrifying. His sleepwalking self had already proved itself capable of astounding feats of unconscious absurdity. So, Balthazar continued, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble, one might argue that your unique affliction, while inconvenient, presents us with a rare opportunity for mutual benefit, a way to prevent future misunderstandings of the, shall we say, nightshirt and crown at dawn variety from escalating into actual armed conflicts. The Eldorian court, which had been simmering with boredom, now straightened, intrigued. When Balthazar spoke of mutual benefit, it usually meant Eldorian benefit, with a thin veneer of civility. Alaric, ever the pragmatist beneath his flustered exterior, felt a flicker of hope. A way to prevent escalation? Your Majesty, I am listening. Excellent, Balthazar declared, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. For too long, the kingdom of Ethelberg and the kingdom of Eldoria have existed in a state of uneasy neutrality, marked only by the occasional border dispute over a particularly fertile patch of bogland or the suspected theft of a prize-winning pig. We have much to gain from a more formalized understanding. And your unique talent, King Alaric, provides the perfect, shall we say, zie casus belli for a new kind of treaty. A treaty based on the undeniable and utterly bewildering reality of a sleepwalking monarch. He paused for effect, allowing the notion to settle, like particularly dense Eldorian fog. General Grimbold, ever the straightforward soldier, grunted. What kind of treaty is that, Your Majesty? A no-pajama wars accord? Precisely, Grimbold. Balthazar barked, a fresh, dry chuckle escaping him. A no-pajama wars accord, or more formally, the Treaty of Nocturnal Perambulation and Royal Remediation. He clapped his hands together, the sound sharp in the stone hole. Quill. Fetch me a fresh parchment and quill. This must be drafted immediately. The royal scribe, Quill, who had been hovering nervously in the background, scurried forward, his fingers fumbling with his writing instruments. Now, Alaric, Balthazar continued, turning his full attention back to the bewildered Ethelbergian king, here are my initial thoughts on the terms of this groundbreaking agreement. Firstly, should your somnambulistic self, God forbid, ever again wander into Eldorian territory, the border guards are hereby instructed not to treat you as a spy, a lunatic, or a particularly disheveled tramp, but as a misplaced, albeit highly perplexing, head of state. They will, however, be authorized to confiscate any and all royal regalia, including crowns, scepters, or indeed, any heirloom chamber pots, until such a time as your waking self can reclaim them with appropriate diplomatic formality. We cannot have royal property littering our moors, now can we? Alaric opened his mouth to protest the confiscation of his crown, but Balthazar continued, relentless. Secondly, upon your discovery, you will be escorted with utmost courtesy to the nearest Eldorian outpost, where you shall be provided with a sturdy, if coarse, change of clothes and sustenance. This sustenance, I must insist, will be your standard Eldorian fare. No croissants, no candied violets, no peculiar cow milk. We must avoid any further exacerbation of your lunar-activated peptides with foreign delicacies for the sake of international stability. The implication was clear. His previous breakfast demands were now enshrined as a potential threat to peace. Alaric shuddered, the taste of the bland porridge still haunting him. But his crown. And my Jersey milk is medically prescribed. Balthazar waved a dismissive hand. Minor details, Alaric. We are discussing peace. Now, in return for our forbearance, and the careful stewardship of your wandering person, Ethelberg shall, from this day forward, provide Eldoria with a quarterly tribute, not of gold, No, that would be too crude. But rather, a tribute of your finest Ethelbergian cheeses. And, since your kingdom is so famed for its gentle virtues, perhaps a regular supply of your renowned Ethelbergian honey. And since your royal physician appears to be such a fount of unique scientific knowledge, perhaps Dr. Rick Oakhaven might be persuaded to share his insights into these lunar-activated peptides with our own royal scholars. For purely academic purposes, you understand. Perhaps even joint research into the weaponization of somnambulism. For defense. Of course. The last part was delivered with a twinkle in Balthazar's eye that sent a shiver down Alaric's spine. Joint research into the weaponization of somnambulism? The thought of an army of sleepwalking, nightshirt-clad soldiers, guided by the moon and the lingering effects of fermented goat milk, was utterly horrifying. Furthermore, Balthazar continued, oblivious to Alaric's growing horror, should your sleepwalking habit prove exceptionally adventurous and lead you into the territories of other, less understanding kingdoms, Eldoria will, upon formal request and suitable compensation, offer assistance in your retrieve. We, after all, have experience in dealing with bewildered, half-dressed monarchs on our borders. Consider it a royal recovery service with Eldorian efficiency. Alaric, utterly speechless, could only stare. This was not merely a treaty, it was a grand, bizarre joke played at his expense, a formalization of his deepest humiliation. His sleepwalking, once a private shame, was now a geopolitical bargaining chip. The thought of Ethelberg's renowned, delicate cheeses being used as a ransom for his unconscious wanderings was almost unbearable. Quill, his quill scratching furiously, looked up. Your Majesty, should we specify the precise quantity and variety of cheese? And the frequency of the honey delivery? Excellent point, Quill. Balthazar beamed. Let us specify 5 wheels of Ethelbergian summer bloom, 3 crocks of meadowsweet honey, and a monthly report from this doctor, Oakhaven, on the precise fluctuations of royal peptides. And should the king, Alaric, exhibit a particularly adventurous nocturnal journey, perhaps a bonus wheel of your smoked Riverbend blue. Yes? A special premium for exceptionally bewildering incidents. Alaric found his voice thin and reedy. This is outrageous. I am a sovereign king. You cannot demand tribute for my mere accidental presence. And my cheeses are for my people. And the honey for my apiaries. And Dr. Oakhaven's research is confidential. Outrageous? Balthazar chuckled, a low rumbling sound. King Alaric, you arrived on my doorstep, clad in your night clothes, babbling about moon-activated gases, and attempting to barter heirloom chamber pots. This is not a matter for outrage, but for pragmatic negotiation. Or, should you prefer, we can simply hold you indefinitely as a potential spy. I imagine the dungeons here are rather draughty, and our porridge, as you know, is rather consistent. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. Indefinite imprisonment. Endless porridge. The sheer, unyielding grimness of Eldorian life. Alaric, faced with this stark reality, felt the last vestiges of his protest crumble. He was trapped. His only escape from this profoundly awkward international incident lay in embracing the very absurdity that had caused it. He sighed, a long, defeated sound that seemed to drain all the air from the room. Very well, Your Majesty. I agree to these terms. Provisionally. Pending ratification by my own court, of course. Ratification. Balthazar roared with laughter again, slapping his knee. Of course. I imagine your Lord Chancellor Fitzwilliam will be positively delighted to sign a treaty formalizing your nocturnal eccentricities. It will save him no end of worry, will it not? He turned to his court. You see, gentlemen, a king, a man of dignity, reduced to trading cheese and honey for the right to sleepwalk undisturbed. This is why Eldoria thrives. We embrace the peculiar and turn it to our advantage. The Eldorian court, though still unsmiling, offered a murmur of what might have been grudging approval. They appreciated a good bargain, even when it involved a half-dressed foreign monarch. Pip, the court jester, who had been listening from the shadows, stepped forward, his bells, for once, jingling with a faint, almost mocking cheerfulness. He bowed to Balthazar, then to Alaric, his ancient eyes twinkling. A king who wanders, a kingdom that waits, a treaty of dreams and curious fates, for moon madness cured by a cheddar so fine, and slumber secured by a honeyed design. What is the price for a peaceful night's rest? A kingdom's dignity put to the test. Balthazar chuckled, a dry, approving sound. A fine summing up, Pip, though I prefer to think of it as a rather shrewd diplomatic maneuver. Alaric, catching the drift of Pip's riddle, felt a fresh surge of humiliation. A kingdom's dignity, indeed. It was precisely that which was now being bartered away. Wheel by wheel of cheese, crock by crock of honey, all to ensure that his own unconscious self did not inadvertently trigger a war. He was a pawn in his own dream, a hostage to his own peculiar affliction. Now King Alaric, Balthazar said, rising from his throne, his voice returning to its normal gruff timbre. We shall draft this treaty with all due haste. In the meantime, you are our guest. A highly unusual guest, certainly, but a guest nonetheless. And perhaps, when the next full moon approaches, we shall observe your slumber more closely. For scientific purposes, you understand. He winked, a gesture that was both unsettling and thoroughly unregal. Alaric merely nodded, too weary to argue, too dismayed to even contemplate the implications of being studied like a particularly odd specimen. He imagined Dr. Oakhaven's delight at such an opportunity, and his own profound misery at having his most private affliction scrutinized by a foreign, cynical court. The great hall, usually a place of solemn decrees and grim pronouncements, now seemed to hum with the low thrum of Balthazar's ongoing amusement. The future of Ethelberg's foreign policy and Alaric's own sanity rested now not on diplomatic skill or military might, but on the unpredictable whims of his sleepwalking self, and the very unique, very Eldorian sense of humor of King Balthazar. The most awkward explanation had led to the most absurd proposal, and Alaric, the sleepwalking monarch, found himself trapped, not by a hostile army, but by the sheer, unyielding comedic logic of the situation. It was going to be a very long negotiation, punctuated by very uncomfortable meals and the ever-present threat of more moon-activated peptide discussion. Chapter 12. The signing of the midnight accord, the lingering echoes of King Balthazar's booming laughter eventually faded, leaving behind a silence in the Eldorian throne room that was thick with the weight of the proposed treaty of nocturnal perambulation and royal remediation. King Alaric, still perched uncomfortably on his small rough stool, felt a profound, almost bone-deep weariness settle over him. His dignity, already a tattered flag fluttering in a harsh wind, had been thoroughly battered. Yet, within the mire of his humiliation, a faint, flickering light of hope had ignited. The prospect of an end to his embarrassing nocturnal escapades, and perhaps more importantly, a safe return to Athelberg, outweighed the absurdity of the current negotiation. The Eldorians, for all their gruffness and peculiar sense of humor, seemed willing to engage, however cynically, with the bizarre reality of his predicament. King Balthazar, his mirth now replaced by a look of stern, albeit still amused, shrewdness, gestured for Quill, the royal scribe, to approach the stone table before his throne. Quill, whose hands were still trembling slightly from the sheer shock of his king's earlier paroxysm of laughter, unrolled a fresh sheet of thick, unbleached parchment. The air in the cavernous hall was suddenly charged with a strange blend of diplomatic tension and cumdic anticipation. The Eldorian court, a gathering of hard-faced men and women in their muted woolens, watched with an almost palpable, if grim, fascination. This was not the usual dull procession of grievances and decrees. This was undoubtedly a singular moment in Eldorian history. "Now, Alaric," Balthazar rumbled, his voice still containing a hint of the earlier amusement. "We shall formalize this understanding. We'll ensure every clause is penned with clarity, and every absurdity given its proper weight. Let this document stand as a testament to the unpredictable nature of sovereignty, and the pragmatic genius of Eldoria in the face of unexpected somnambulism." Quill dipped his quill into the ink pot, a new clean one, devoid of the usual Eldorian rhyme. He poised it over the parchment, his brow furrowed with the immense responsibility of translating such a uniquely bizarre situation into formal diplomatic language. "Article 1, Balthazar dictated, his voice resonating through the hall, his eyes fixed on Alaric. "Henceforth, should King Alaric of Ethelberg, in his sleep-addled state, by whatever means or means not yet conceived by the mind of man, find himself upon the sovereign lands of Eldoria, he shall not be considered an invader, an enemy combatant, or a particularly disheveled vagrant. He shall instead be acknowledged as a sovereign in temporary nocturnal transit, a guest of peculiar yet undeniable circumstance." Alaric gritted his teeth. Sovereign in temporary nocturnal transit. The words were a bitter pill. Quill's quill scratched furiously across the parchment, recording the ignominious preamble. "Article 2, Balthazar continued, the corner of his mouth twitching. Upon the discovery of the aforementioned king, Alaric within Eldorian borders, the loyal border patrols, specifically designated and trained for this most unusual task, shall undertake measures of gentle redirection. They shall, under no circumstances, employ force, loud noises, or any sudden movements that might startle the slumbering monarch into an untimely and potentially disorienting awakening. Instead, they shall approach with measured steps, humming softly a traditional Eldorian lullaby. I suggest the Ballad of the Stone Golem and the Restless Shepherd. It is suitably soothing and shall endeavor to gently guide the monarch by the arm or shoulder, or, if conditions necessitate, by the silken cord of his nightshirt towards the established return pathway to Ethelberg." Alaric stared, aghast. A lullaby? Guided by his nightshirt. The notion was so utterly mortifying, so profoundly undignified, that it almost overshadowed the promise of peaceful redirection. He imagined a burly Eldorian guard, humming off-key, leading his sleepwalking self like a particularly confused child. And, Balthazar added, a wicked glint in his eye. Any royal regalia found upon the person of the somnambulistic monarch, including crowns, scepters, or indeed any highly ornate chamber pots, shall be immediately, yet carefully, confiscated and held in trust by the Eldorian crown, to be returned only to King Alaric's waking self upon his safe return to his own realm, and then only upon formal request, accompanied by an additional symbolic tribute of one wheel of Ethelbergian smoked Riverbend blue cheese. We cannot have royal artifacts left to be trampled by our livestock. Alaric spluttered. But the crown, the additional cheese, it's extortion. Balthazar merely raised a bushy eyebrow. Pragmatism, Alaric. Poor pragmatism. Quill. Ensure the cheese clause is precisely worded. Now, Article 3. In recognition of Eldoria's forbearance, hospitality, and invaluable royal redirection services, the Kingdom of Ethelberg shall henceforth provide to the Kingdom of Eldoria a quarterly tribute. This tribute shall consist of five wheels of Ethelbergian summer bloom cheese. renowned for its delicate notes and questionable nutritional value in a harsh climate. And three crocks of Ethelbergian meadow sweet honey. This tribute shall be delivered promptly and without complaint, serving as a token of Ethelberg's commitment to harmonious, if peculiar, international relations. General Grimbold, whose face had remained impassive throughout the proceedings, let out a satisfied grunt. Cheese and honey. He understood cheese and honey. And furthermore, Balthazar dictated, his voice gaining a touch of academic seriousness, Article 4, recognizing the groundbreaking nature of Dr. Phineas O'Caven's work on Luna-activated peptides and their influence on somnambulistic perambulations. The Kingdom of Ethelberg shall undertake to share all relevant research and findings with the Royal Eldorian College of Holistic Humors and Practical Alchemy. A designated Eldorian scholar shall be permitted access to Dr. O'Caven's notes, and indeed to the physician himself, for purposes of collaborative study. This collaboration shall aim to further understand, and potentially, I stress potentially, harness such unique physiological phenomena for the mutual benefit and defensive capabilities of both kingdoms. We are particularly interested in the precise caloric output of a nightshirt-clad individual scaling a castle wall, and the potential applications of said peptides in enhancing guard endurance. Alaric shuddered inwardly at the thought of Dr. O'Caven, bubbling with unbridled enthusiasm, revealing the full, glorious absurdity of his theories to a group of grim Eldorian scholars, who would no doubt attempt to distill it into some form of grim Eldorian weapon, the weaponization of sleepwalking. It was too much. Article 5, Balthazar continued, his tone turning grave. Should King Alaric's somnambulistic journeys extend beyond the immediate borders of Eldoria, leading him into the territories of less understanding, or more volatile kingdoms, the Kingdom of Eldoria, upon receiving a formal request from Ethelberg, and a suitable advance payment to be negotiated at the time, but for illustrative purposes, let us say no less than 10 additional wheels of your finest winter hearth cheddar, shall dispatch a specialized royal recovery unit. This unit, trained in discreet retrieval methods, will endeavor to locate and gently redirect the misplaced monarch, utilizing the aforementioned soothing lullabies and delicate guidance techniques. Our efficiency in such matters is, I assure you, unparalleled. Alaric groaned aloud. His very existence was now becoming a line item in a foreign budget, a service requiring payment in cheese. And finally, Balthazar announced, leaning back with a satisfied expression, Article 6, this treaty, the Midnight Accord as it shall be known, shall be signed by both ruling monarchs and witnessed by their respective highest-ranking officials. It shall be ratified by both courts, and shall remain in effect for the foreseeable future, or until such a time as King Alaric ceases his nocturnal wanderings, or until such a time as a more amusing and geopolitically significant phenomenon presents itself. Quill finished writing, his fingers cramped. He laid the parchment flat, smoothing it carefully. The Eldorian court watched in utter silence, their faces betraying little emotion, though a few of the younger guards exchanged bewildered glances. General Grimbold merely grunted again, apparently satisfied that Eldoria was getting a good deal on cheese. Alaric felt a profound sense of resignation. He was trapped. His only path back to Ethelberg, to his crown, to his relatively predictable existence, lay through this bizarre, humiliating pact. He imagined Lord Chancellor Fitzwilliam's apoplectic fit upon reading the terms, particularly the clauses about the lullabies and the chamber pot. But what choice did he have? He was alone, in his borrowed, scratchy wool, completely at the mercy of King Balthazar's dark humor and Eldorian pragmatism. Balthazar motioned for a heavy ink-stained quill. He grasped it, dipped it, and with a flourish that was surprisingly elegant for a man of his bulk, scrawled his formidable signature, Balthazar F., King of Eldoria, at the bottom of the parchment. He then pushed the document towards Alaric. Your turn, King Alaric. A testament to your unusual journey and to our kingdom's newfound, if unconventional, understanding. A fresh quill, thinner and less formidable than Balthazar's, was offered to Alaric by Quill. Alaric took it, his hand trembling slightly. He looked down at the absurd document, seeing not just the words, but the sheer, sprawling tapestry of his own misfortune woven into its clauses. He imagined the headlines in the Ethelbergian gazettes. King Alaric barters kingdom's dignity for sleepwalking privileges, cheese for somnambulism. Ethelberg's new foreign policy. With a sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 misplaced croissants, King Alaric inscribed his signature, Alaric Rex, King of Athelberg beneath Balthazar's. His hand shook, making his normally precise script waver slightly. The ink seemed to bleed into the rough parchment, a visual metaphor for the bleeding of his own regal dignity. The act was witnessed by General Grimbold, who signed with a heavy, unyielding mark, and by Pip, the court jester, who, for the first time, produced a quill from a hidden pocket in his motley, and signed his name with a flourish, his bells jingling softly, a sound that seemed to carry a strange, knowing amusement. He alone, perhaps, truly understood the profound cosmic joke that had just been formalized. Balthazar clapped his hands together, a sound like thunder. It is done. The Midnight Accord. A new era of understanding, forged in the crucible of nocturnal wandering and royal embarrassment. He rose from his throne, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. Quill, let copies be made, and dispatch a messenger to Ethelberg at once. Inform them that their king is safe, and that a treaty, most favorable to both parties, has been agreed upon. And tell them to prepare their finest cheeses. Alaric watched, helpless, as Quill rolled up the signed parchment. A testament to the most bizarre diplomatic agreement in recorded history. He was safe, yes, but at what cost? His kingdom's cheese reserves, his royal crown held hostage, and the very details of his private affliction now, a matter of international law. He had, through the sheer unyielding power of his sleepwalking, inadvertently created a new, absurd chapter in Ethelbergian foreign policy. The Eldorian court began to disperse, a low murmur of conversation replacing the earlier silence. They were not smiling, for Eldorians rarely did, but there was a palpable sense of satisfaction. They had gained cheese and honey, and the entertainment of a peculiar king, all for the price of a few lullabies and a system of gentle redirection. Alaric, however, remained on his stool, a profound sense of quiet despair washing over him. He was no longer just the sleepwalking monarch. He was the sleepwalking monarch whose sleepwalking had become the foundation of a ridiculous yet binding international treaty. The Eldorian night, cold and unforgiving, seemed to hum with the low, dry chuckle of a king who truly appreciated the depths of human absurdity. The stage was set for a future filled with unusual diplomatic exchanges, all orchestrated by the unconscious whims of one perpetually bewildered king. Chapter 13. The return journey. The ink on the Midnight Accord, that most peculiar of international agreements, had barely dried before the arrangements for King Alaric's return journey to Athelberg were set in motion. He stood in the great hall of Stonehaven Keep, still clad in the coarse, chafing Eldorian woolens that felt less like attire and more like a punishment, a visual testament to his recent, unwelcome adventures. His crown, the very symbol of his sovereignty and dignity, remained conspicuously absent, secured, he was told, within a guarded Eldorian strongbox, awaiting the promised wheel of Athelbergian smoked Riverbend blue cheese. The thought of his cherished royal circlet being held for ransom, even a cheese-based ransom, grated on his very soul. King Balthazar, who had with a surprising degree of efficiency overseen the drafting and signing of the treaty, now regarded Alaric with a final lingering glance of profound amusement. "Farewell, King Alaric," Balthazar rumbled, his voice echoing in the stone hall. "May your future slumbers be more geographically contained. And remember, we shall eagerly await the arrival of your first tribute, and the reports from this Dr. Oakhaven. His insights into cranial gases and moon peptides are of considerable interest." He finished with a dry chuckle that sent a shiver down Alaric's spine. The Eldorian court, observing this final exchange, maintained their customary grim-faced silence, though Alaric fancied he detected a faint collective flicker of suppressed mirth in their unblinking eyes. His escort consisted of a small contingent of Eldorian border guards, hand-picked by Captain Thistlewick himself. Leading them was Borin, whose face seemed perpetually carved from disappointment, and Fendrel, whose perpetually runny nose remained his most distinctive feature. They were accompanied by 3 other equally taciturn and unimpressed guards, all armed with their usual halberds and an entirely new treaty-mandated set of extra soft Selene Solate boots. These boots, Alaric noted with a fresh wave of mortification, were specifically designed for the gentle redirection of sleepwalking monarchs, ensuring that their approach would not rouse a slumbering sovereign. The mere existence of such footwear, a direct result of his own nocturnal habits, was a humiliation in itself. The journey back across the Eldorian moors was, for King Alaric, an exercise in profound, introspective misery. The air was still biting, the sky a relentless gray, and the landscape stretched before him in a monotonous expanse of heather and rock. He walked, his boots squelching occasionally in the damp earth, his mind a tumultuous sea of reflection. He reflected first on the sheer, bewildering absurdity of his situation. He, King Alaric, a monarch whose reign had, until recently, been characterized by an almost profound lack of noteworthy incident, was now at the center of an international treaty, its very existence predicated on his uncontrollable nocturnal ramblings. His private affliction, a source of quiet shame and endless frustration for his court, had been laid bare before a foreign power, dissected, and then enshrined in diplomatic law. He had, quite literally, walked his kingdom into an alliance based on personal embarrassment. He thought of Dr. Phineas Oakhaven, his eccentric royal physician, the Luna-activated peptides, the fermented goat milk got, the very specific, non-peptidic properties of Jersey cow milk daughters, the moon-repelling curtains, woven with silver thread, and scented with garlic and rosemary. All of it, a meticulously constructed, utterly absurd, yet undeniably earnest medical theory, now formally recognized and even, to his horror, to be collaboratively studied by Eldorian scholars for the purposes of weaponization. He imagined Dr. Oakhaven, in a flurry of unbridled academic zeal, attempting to explain the subtleties of internal fermentation to General Grimbold, who would no doubt attempt to distill it into a particularly potent form of gaseous weaponry. The thought was almost unbearable. Then there was the treaty itself, the Midnight Accord. He replayed its clauses in his mind, each one a fresh stab at his already wounded dignity. The gentle redirection by Eldorian border patrols, the traditional Eldorian lullabies. Alaric cringed, imagining Borin and Fendrel humming the ballad of the stone golem while trying to guide his somnambulistic self away from a particularly appealing rock formation. The automatic confiscation of his crown, now held as collateral, and the quarterly tribute, 5 wheels of summer bloom cheese and 3 crocks of meadowsweet honey. Ethelburg's delicate, refined produce, a hallmark of their genteel civilization, now destined to satiate the gruff appetites of Eldoria. It was a trade of comfort for compliance, of luxury for peace, and Alaric felt keenly the sting of the perceived defeat. He had lost his crown and gained a permanent supply chain for dairy and apiary products to a kingdom whose culinary tastes were, to put it mildly, uninspired. He glanced at his escorts. Borin and Fendrel marched with a stoic, unhurried pace their faces betraying no emotion. Yet, Alaric sensed a shift in their demeanor. They no longer regarded him as a mere lunatic or a potential spy. There was a new, subtle, almost imperceptible air of professional responsibility, mixed with a faint underlying current of resigned amusement. They were, after all, simply doing their job, a job that had now expanded to include the supervision of sleepwalking foreign dignitaries. He wondered if this experience would become a new addition to their border guard training manual. Perhaps a section on distinguishing royal somnambulists from common drunkards, or advanced techniques for gentle monarchical redirection. He thought of his own kingdom. What would Lord Chancellor Fitzwilliam say? Fitzwilliam, whose forehead was already a permanent roadmap of worry, would surely collapse entirely when he read the full text of the Midnight Accord. General Magnus, the pragmatic soldier, would no doubt be appalled by the lack of military might involved in this diplomatic solution, and perhaps even more so by the notion of lullabies as a tactical maneuver. And Lady Beatrice, the Queen's lady-in-waiting, would surely faint at the sheer impropriety of it all. He imagined the whispers in the court, the thinly veiled snickers behind cupped hands. His reputation, already slightly whimsical due to his nocturnal habits, would now be irrevocably stamped with the mark of the absurd. The journey continued, marked by the rhythmic squelch of their boots and the relentless gray of the sky. Alaric considered the irony. He, a king who had always prided himself on his steady hand and predictable nature, had inadvertently become the most unpredictable force in his own kingdom's foreign policy. His subconscious, it seemed, possessed a more adventurous spirit and a keener eye for border crossings than his waking self. It was a deeply humbling realization. As they approached the ancient standing stone that marked the official, though often ill-defined, border between Eldoria and Athelberg, the landscape subtly shifted. The heather and gnarled rocks of Eldoria gave way to a softer, greener expanse, dotted with more trees and the faint, comforting scent of damp soil and distant cultivated fields. A thin, hopeful ray of sunlight even managed to pierce the clouds, casting a weak, watery glow on the familiar terrain. And there, waiting just beyond the standing stone, was a sight that filled Alaric with a complex mixture of relief and renewed dread. A contingent of his own night sentinels, their faces a mixture of profound exhaustion, palpable relief, and a desperate attempt to maintain their usual stoic composure. Leading them was Sir Callan, his face still bearing the faint imprint of a royal foot, and Lord Chancellor Fitzwilliam, whose facial furrows seemed to have deepened into veritable trenches overnight. General Magnus, mounted on his warhorse, looked less like a warrior awaiting battle and more like a man contemplating a particularly complex tax form. The Eldorian guards halted a respectful, yet still pragmatic, distance from the border. Borin stepped forward, his expression wooden, as he addressed Lord Fitzwilliam. "Lord Chancellor," he grunted, his voice flat, "we return your esteemed monarch, King Alaric, as per the terms of the newly signed Midnight Accord." He gestured vaguely at Alaric, who stood feeling utterly exposed in his scratchy Eldorian woolens. Lord Fitzwilliam, upon seeing Alaric, let out a choked sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "Your Majesty, you are safe. By all that is holy, we feared the worst." His eyes, however, then fell upon Alaric's attire, or lack of his usual regal attire, and the absence of his crown. His relief quickly morphed into an expression of utter bewilderment, tinged with a familiar rising panic. "And your crown, your Majesty? And your garments?" Borin's answer was delivered with a complete lack of emotional inflection. "The crown, Lord Chancellor, is currently held by the Eldorian crown, as per Article 2 of the Midnight Accord, pending the delivery of one wheel of Ethelbergian smoked Riverbend blue cheese. The garments provided were those deemed suitable for travel within Eldorian territory." And the matter of the lunar-activated peptides and the associated medical research is covered under Article 4. Fitzwilliam's jaw dropped. He looked from Alaric to Borin, to the Eldorian guard's soft-soled boots, then to General Magnus, whose face had gone from merely weary to a profound shade of confused gray. The very mention of the lunar-activated peptides, coming from an Eldorian guard, was enough to send a ripple of profound, disbelieving shock through the Ethelbergian contingent. Alaric stepped forward, leaving the Eldorian guards behind, entering his own kingdom as if stepping onto a stage for an entirely unwanted performance. He looked at his loyal, bewildered court, then back at the impassive Eldorians. "Lord Chancellor," Alaric said, his voice weary but with a newfound, almost melancholic gravitas, "it has been an eventful night, and a most illuminating negotiation." He paused, then gestured vaguely towards the Eldorian side. "The Eldorians have been most pragmatic. Borin and Fendrel, their duty done, merely stood, silent and unmoving, observing the scene with the detached curiosity of men who had seen too much. They had returned the king. The treaty was signed. The cheese and honey were due. Their part was finished." Alaric knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his life and the life of his kingdom had irrevocably changed. He was no longer merely King Alaric of Ethelberg. He was King Alaric, the sleepwalking monarch whose nocturnal perambulations had redefined international diplomacy. He was the king who traded cheese for peace and his dignity for security. He looked out at the misty moors, at the familiar yet now strangely alien landscape of his own border, and a profound sigh escaped him. The journey back was complete, but the true bewildering odyssey of his reign had only just begun. The sun, finally breaking through the clouds, cast a long, peculiar shadow that seemed to stretch from Ethelberg into the pragmatic, unsmiling heart of Eldoria, a silent testament to the unpredictable nature of sleep, and the even more unpredictable nature of the agreements forged in its bewildering depths. Chapter 14. The court's reaction, the return of King Alaric to Castle Ethelberg, was, to put it mildly, less a triumphant homecoming and more a profoundly awkward re-entry. He stood in the grand receiving hall, a space usually reserved for pomp and solemn declarations, clad in the Eldorian woolens that chafed his skin like a particularly stubborn conscience. His royal brow was furrowed with a mixture of exhaustion and the indelible memory of Eldorian porridge. Before him stood his inner circle, Lord Chancellor Fitzwilliam, whose face was now a masterpiece of intricate worry lines; General Magnus, whose usual stoic military bearing had dissolved into a bewildered slump; Lady Beatrice, the Queen's chief lady-in-waiting, whose delicate features were contorted into an expression of profound, almost physical, distress; and Dr. Phineas Oakhaven, the royal physician whose unkempt beard seemed to bristle with an almost electric anticipation. The air, usually thick with the scent of beeswax and ambition, now carried the faint, lingering whiff of damp Eldorian sheep. The initial moments had been a blur of relieved gasps, hurried questions, and Fitzwilliam's repeated, near-hysterical queries about the king's crown. Alaric, too weary to maintain a full regal composure, had simply raised a hand, a gesture that, in his rough Eldorian tunic, looked less like a kingly command and more like a man warding off a particularly persistent gnat. "My lords, Lady Beatrice," he had managed to utter, his voice raspy, "I assure you I am unharmed, though my dignity has suffered a blow from which it may never recover." They had retired to a more private chamber, a smaller, less imposing room off the main hall, where a roaring fire battled valiantly against the persistent Ethelbergian damp. Hot sugar tea, a blessing after the Eldorian sour ale, was placed before Alaric. He clutched the warm cup, deriving immense comfort from its familiar weight. It was here, in the relative quiet, that King Alaric began his tale, a narrative so profoundly bizarre that it would forever alter the course of Ethelbergian foreign policy and the collective mental well-being of his closest advisors. He began with the rude awakening on the Eldorian moor. The unimpressed border guards Borin and Fendrel, and their unyielding pragmatism. Fitzwilliam's eyebrows, which had been attempting to scale his forehead since Alaric's appearance, rose higher still at the mention of the shiny pot accusation regarding the royal crown. The sheer audacity, Fitzwilliam spluttered, clutching his chest, to mistake his Majesty's sacred circlet for a lavatory receptacle. Lady Beatrice let out a small horrified gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. General Magnus, however, merely grunted, his mind already contemplating the strategic implications of a border patrol that mistook royalty for drunks. Alaric then recounted his unpleasant breakfast at Thistlewick's bastion, the coarse Eldorian porridge, and the shocking refusal of his request for croissants, Jersey milk, and candied violets. Lady Beatrice paled further. "No croissants?" she whispered, as if the very fabric of civilization had unraveled. "And the Jersey milk, Your Majesty, the crucial element of Dr. Oakhaven's prescribed cure." They refused. Her gaze swung to Dr. Oakhaven, who, rather than expressing outrage, merely stroked his beard, a faint, almost visionary gleam in his eyes. The story progressed to the journey to Stonehaven Keep, King Balthazar's grim welcome, and the peculiar, almost taunting amusement with which the Eldorian monarch had received him. Alaric, mustering a newfound weary candor, even spoke of Pip, the court jester, and his unnervingly accurate riddles that had cut through the Eldorian court's cynicism, and to Alaric's horror, almost revealed the truth of his predicament with alarming clarity. And then, Alaric continued, taking a bracing sip of his tea, "I was summoned before King Balthazar and his entire court. He compelled me to explain my condition, my sleepwalking, my Luna-activated peptides." A profound silence descended, thick enough to be sliced with a ceremonial dagger. Fitzwilliam blinked slowly, his mind struggling to reconcile the gravity of the situation with the sudden influx of Dr. Oakhaven's unique medical terminology. Lady Beatrice looked utterly lost. General Magnus' expression remained stubbornly unreadable, though a faint muscle twitched in his jaw. Dr. Oakhaven, however, practically vibrated with excitement. "The peptides." "He accepted the truth of the peptides, Your Majesty," he interjected, a triumphant glint in his eye. "A truly enlightened monarch." "I knew my theories, though perhaps novel, held universal scientific merit." Alaric sighed. "Accepted, Doctor." He roared with laughter. He found it endlessly amusing. He called it exquisite and magnificent. He suggested my royal bowels were conspiring with the moon, and General Grimbold openly snorted and called me gassy. Dr. Oakhaven's expression crumpled from triumph to profound offense. "Gassy? The uncultured boor. It is an ethereal vapor, Your Majesty, a noble gas, the very essence of somnambulistic propulsion. To equate it with common flatulence, the sheer barbarity." "Indeed, Doctor, the Eldorians seem to have a rather robust understanding of pragmatism over delicacy," Alaric said dryly. "But that was not the worst of it. Then came the treaty." He paused, gathering his resolve, then recounted the terms of the Midnight Accord. He detailed Article 1, concerning his status as a sovereign in temporary, nocturnal transit. Fitzwilliam's face went from pale to a ghastly shade of green. "Temporary, nocturnal transit. But, Your Majesty, you are the King of Ethelberg. You do not transit anywhere without a full retinue and prior diplomatic agreement." Article 2, Alaric continued, ignoring Fitzwilliam's rising agitation. "Stipulates gentle redirection by Eldorian border patrols, who are instructed to hum the ballad of the stone golem and the restless shepherd, while guiding my slumbering form back across the border, and that my crown, indeed all royal regalia, shall be confiscated and held hostage until a wheel of smoked Riverbend blue cheese is delivered." Fitzwilliam let out a strangled cry, a sound like a mortally wounded badger. A lullaby, and cheese for a crown. Your Majesty, this is not a treaty. This is a ransom note penned by a madman. My heavens, the very dignity of Ethelberg is being traded for dairy products. He buried his face in his hands, trembling. Lady Beatrice had to discreetly fan him with a conveniently placed royal proclamation. General Magnus, usually impervious, finally showed signs of deep distress. Lullabies as a tactical measure. This is unprecedented and utterly disgraceful. My men trained for years to defend our borders, and now they are to be replaced by tuneless crooning and soft-soled boots. His voice rose in genuine military outrage. And smoked, riverbent blue? That's our prize-winning cheese, the very emblem of our agricultural excellence. Article 3. Alaric pressed on, his voice flat. Requires a quarterly tribute of 5 wheels of summer bloom cheese and 3 crocks of meadow-sweet honey, a token of our newfound harmonious, if peculiar, international relations. 5 wheels, 3 crocks. Fitzwilliam wailed, rising from his chair and pacing frantically. Your Majesty, our cheese reserves, our apiaries. We shall be reduced to a dairy farm and a honey pot for Eldoria. Our economy will collapse under the weight of such an absurd tribute. Dr. Oakhaven, however, seemed to have regained some of his earlier excitement. But what of Article 4, Your Majesty? The collaborative study of my lunar-activated peptides. Did they truly agree to scientific discourse? Alaric looked at him, a flicker of something akin to grim satisfaction in his eyes. Indeed, Doctor. King Balthazar was most interested in the weaponization of somnambulism. He wished to know about the precise caloric output of a nightshirt-clad individual scaling a castle wall, and the potential applications of peptides in enhancing guard endurance. Dr. Oakhaven's eyes widened, a smile slowly spreading across his face, entirely missing the horrifying implication. Weaponization. Remarkable. An entirely new field of military medicine. Imagine, King Alaric, an army of somnambulistic super-soldiers, utterly impervious to fatigue, guided by the very forces of the cosmos. My life's work, finally understood and appreciated by a discerning sovereign. He began scribbling furiously in a small notebook, already formulating new theories about the martial applications of fermented goat milk. General Magnus, upon hearing weaponization of somnambulism, looked as if he might faint. An army of sleepwalking soldiers? He muttered, horrified. What kind of general would lead such and such an abominable force? They'd wander into their own supply lines. They'd accidentally declare war on a flock of particularly aggressive geese. And Article 5, Alaric continued, ignoring the rising cacophony. Stipulatus that should I wander into a third kingdom, Eldoria will provide a royal recovery unit for a suitable advance payment of 10 additional wheels of winter hearth cheddar. Fitzwilliam staggered, visibly clutching at his throat. More cheese. We are to become a roaming cheese dispenser for your Majesty's unconscious perambulations. He sank back into his chair, a faint whimper escaping him. My career, my life's work reduced to cheese tariffs and lullabies. Lady Beatrice, recovering from her initial shock, now focused on the sheer indignity of it all. Your Majesty, to be held for ransom by cheese. To be led like a child by singing guards. The Queen will be mortified. The court will be in hysterics. What will the foreign dignitaries say? The annual Royal Almanac will have to dedicate an entire new section to unscheduled monarchical departures and their pecuniary consequences. She wrung her hands, a picture of aristocratic distress. And finally, Alaric finished, his voice now laced with a profound and personal weariness. The treaty, the Midnight Accord, as it is known, was signed by both myself and King Balthazar, witnessed by his general and his jester. It is now official. Binding kont denan. He pulled a rolled piece of parchment from within his Eldorian tunic, the official copy of the accord, still bearing the faint scent of Eldorian damp and Balthazar's rough signature. He laid it gently on the table. The silence that followed this final pronouncement was not absolute, but rather a chaotic symphony of internal anguish. Fitzwilliam was emitting a low, continuous moan, punctuated by gasps. General Magnus was rubbing his temples, his mind clearly struggling to recategorize his understanding of warfare. Lady Beatrice had resorted to a vigorous fanning motion, though her own face was now as pale as the king's. Dr. Oakhaven, however, remained curiously detached, his eyes gleaming, already lost in a world of potential scientific breakthroughs involving enhanced sleepwalking guard endurance. "Your Majesty," Fitzwilliam finally managed to stammer, his voice thin with disbelief. "Do you truly mean to tell us that the future of Ethelberg's relationship with Eldoria, a relationship previously defined by mutual suspicion and the occasional grumbled border report, is now based entirely on your nocturnal ramblings? And that our most valuable cheeses are to be sacrificed on the altar of your wandering cerebellum?" Alaric looked at his Lord Chancellor, at his loyal distressed general, and at his scandalized lady. He saw their genuine concern, their horror, and the profound second-hand embarrassment that washed over them like a tide. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was responsible for this monumental absurdity. "It would appear so, Lord Chancellor," Alaric said, his voice quiet. "I am, alas, the sleepwalking monarch, whose affliction has become a matter of international law. The choice, I was given to understand, was between signing this accord, or remaining indefinitely in Eldorian dungeons, consuming endless porridge, and being studied as a particularly peculiar specimen of Ethelbergian lunacy." General Magnus slapped the table, a sudden surprisingly loud thud. "Dungens. Your Majesty, we would have launched an expedition, a rescue mission." Alaric raised an eyebrow, a flicker of his old dry wit returning. "Indeed, General. An expedition composed of your finest soldiers, armed with swords and the latest military strategies, attempting to rescue their nightshirt-clad sovereign from a grim Eldorian dungeon, while being pelted with Eldorian porridge and serenaded by Eldorian lullabies. I confess the strategic implications seemed rather limited." Magnus winced. The image was, indeed, not one that inspired military confidence. "And the crown," Fitzwilliam whispered, his voice tinged with a tragic despair. "The Ethelbergian crown, held for cheese? Oh, Your Majesty, the historical precedents alone will overwhelm us. Future historians will merely laugh." Alaric sighed, a deep, profound sound. "They will, Lord Chancellor. They will. But for now, we have peace. A peace purchased, it seems, with cheese, honey, and the occasional gently redirected royal perambulation. Such is the unpredictable nature of sovereignty. And sleep." He looked at the signed document, then out the window at the familiar, if still damp, landscape of Ethelberg. He had returned, but not as the same king. He was now, irrevocably, the king who had sleepwalked his kingdom into the most absurd treaty in recorded history. And the sun, finally breaking fully through the clouds, cast a long, peculiar shadow that seemed to stretch, not just across the castle courtyard, but across the bewildered faces of his devoted, yet utterly mortified, court. The real work, it seemed, had only just begun. Chapter 15. The new royal sleep protocol, the return of King Alaric to Castle Ethelberg, though initially met with a torrent of relief from his frantic court, quickly dissolved into a fresh wave of profound second-hand embarrassment and administrative panic. Lord Chancellor Fitzwilliam, having clutched the signed midnight accord as if it were a particularly venomous serpent, had then proceeded to read its clauses aloud. his voice growing fainter with each outrageous stipulation, until he resembled a man slowly expiring from an overdose of bureaucratic horror. General Magnus, after digesting the implications of gentle redirection and lullabies as tactical measures, had retreated to his chambers, reportedly to rewrite the entire Ethelbergian military doctrine, to include a chapter on non-violent disengagement with sleepwalking foreign dignitary. Lady Beatrice had taken to her bed, suffering from a severe case of the vapors, brought on by the sheer impropriety of her king being held for cheese ransom. Only Dr. Phineas Oakhaven, the royal physician, remained oddly buoyant, his eyes gleaming with the manic excitement of a scholar whose obscure theories had just been given international validation, however ignominious the circumstances. The very air in Castle Ethelberg, usually thick with the scent of old parchment and roast mutton, now seemed to hum with an undercurrent of collective anxiety and the faint, yet persistent, tang of panic. The immediate aftermath of Alaric's return was characterized by a flurry of frantic meetings, whispered consultations, and the desperate unified conviction that such a diplomatic near-disaster must never, under any circumstances, be allowed to repeat itself. The solution, it was unanimously decided, lay in a new comprehensive and utterly inescapable royal sleep protocol. Lord Chancellor Fitzwilliam, despite his lingering apoplexy, spearheaded the initiative. He convened a special subcommittee known grimly as the Nocturnal Containment Council, whose sole purpose was to devise a foolproof method of keeping King Alaric securely in his bed, or at the very least within the confines of his castle. The council comprised Fitzwilliam himself, whose sleep had now entirely abandoned him, General Magnus, who approached the task with the grim determination of a besieging army, Lady Beatrice, whose focus, even in her delicate state, remained on the preservation of royal decorum, and of course Dr. Phineas Oakhaven, whose input, while perpetually baffling, was now seen as tragically indispensable due to the Eldorian's peculiar interest in his peptides. The first measure, immediately implemented, involved a drastic overhaul of the royal bedchamber. Master Cuthbert, the royal tailor whose sighs now held the resonance of a mournful foghorn, was tasked with designing a new set of royal nightclothes. These were not merely the silk or fine linen garments Alaric was accustomed to. No, these new nightshirts, fashioned from a particularly robust, unbleached cotton, were reinforced with extra stitching and fitted with a series of small, exquisitely crafted silver bells. Not decorative bells, mind you, but functional ones, meticulously placed along the cuffs, the hem, and even, to Alaric's enduring mortification, around the collar. The idea, as explained by Fitzwilliam with a pained expression, was that any movement, however slight, by the sleepwalking king would immediately alert the night sentinels. Cuthbert, after much deliberation, had settled on a chime that was sufficiently clear to be heard, yet not so jarring as to startle the king into an even more energetic state of somnambulism. The resultant sound when Alaric donned his new nightshirt was a faint, almost melodic tinkling, like a particularly well-attended ghostly sleigh. Alaric, upon trying them on, felt less like a sovereign and more like a particularly large, very disgruntled festive ornament. The next measure involved the complete redesign of the royal bed itself. Under Dr. Oakhaven's enthusiastic, if bizarre, supervision, the king's bed was transformed into what could only be described as a luxurious, yet entirely inescapable enclosure. Stout, polished oak posts, thicker than Alaric's own thigh, replaced the existing bedposts. These posts were equipped with intricate, yet easily releasable, leather straps that could be quickly secured around the king's ankles and wrists once he had fallen asleep. Dr. Oakhaven insisted that the straps be crafted from the hide of a particularly placid, non-peptidic Jersey cow, believing this would somehow contribute to the lunar nullification effect. Alaric, upon first seeing his new sleeping arrangements, felt a distinct kinship with a particularly well-fed, yet regrettably tethered, livestock animal beyond the bed. The entire bedchamber was fortified. The moon-repelling curtains, already crafted from heavy silver-threaded velvet and scented with garlic, were now augmented with additional layers of lead lining on Dr. Oakhaven's insistence, as he believed lead had a unique capacity to deflect errant lunar energies and the gravitational pull that supposedly stimulated the somnambulistic peptides. The windows, already narrow, were fitted with iron grates of such robust construction that they could withstand a direct siege. The door, previously a stout oak affair, was now reinforced with multiple iron bars, a triple lock mechanism, and, at General Magnus's insistence, a small, strategically placed trapdoor directly above it, allowing a guard to drop a weighted net should the king exhibit any particularly aggressive escape attempts. The night sentinels, those long-suffering guardians of royal slumber, found their duties expanded beyond mere retrieval. They were now required to undergo a specialized training regimen, led by General Magnus, in sleepwalking, monarch, containment, and redirection. This involved drills in silent movement, enhanced by their new soft-soled boots. The effective deployment of gentle restraints, the Jersey cow leather straps proving surprisingly effective, and the proper vocalization of soothing Eldorian lullabies. A small but dedicated choir of the most tuneless guards was even formed, their nightly task to softly hum the ballad of the stone golem outside the king's bedchamber, a discordant yet undeniably well-meaning attempt to lull his restless subconscious. Sir Calen, still bearing the faint bruise of Alaric's royal foot, found himself leading these exercises with a grim, world-weary determination. The royal kitchens, under the watchful, and frankly rather terrified, eye of Lord Fitzwilliam, implemented a draconian new dietary regimen for His Majesty. All goat milk, of course, remained unequivocally banned. But now, even certain types of cheese, particularly the more fermented, pungent varieties, were restricted on the grounds that they might contain unlisted peptides. King Alaric's breakfast of Jersey cow milk became a sacred ritual, delivered under armed guard and subjected to microscopic inspection by Dr. Oakhaven, who would periodically sniff it with the intensity of a bloodhound on a particularly rare scent. Croissant and candied violets, once mere comforts, were now regarded as dangerously subversive foodstuffs capable of inciting international incidents. His diet, previously varied and luxurious, became a monotonous cycle of bland, non-fermenting, and utterly peptide-free sustenance. Even the royal astrologer, a man usually consulted only for auspicious wedding dates or particularly favorable times for launching new trade vessels, found his duties dramatically altered. He was now required to provide daily, meticulously detailed charts of the moon's phases, its gravitational pull, and its precise effect on the king's astrological temperament. His predictions, delivered in a hushed, reverent tone, were used to determine the exact level of nocturnal vigilance required each night. A waxing gibbous moon meant extra straps, louder lullabies, and the entire night sentinel contingent on high alert, armed with their nets and their particularly soothing vocalizations. The castle itself underwent a subtle transformation. Certain corridors were quietly sealed off at night with temporary, yet surprisingly sturdy, barricades. Loose tapestries were resecured, slippery floors were carpeted, and any potentially tempting objects like misplaced scepters, valuable maps, or anything resembling a particularly bartering-worthy chamber pot, were meticulously locked away each evening. It was a kingdom preparing for a ghostly invasion, or at least the stealthy perambulations of its own crowned head. King Alaric himself reacted to this elaborate new protocol with a profound, almost Zen-like resignation. He had, after all, seen the unyielding pragmatism of Eldoria. He had signed the Midnight Accord. He was, quite literally, a man whose dignity had been traded for peace. He submitted to the nightly ritual of donning his bell-laden nightshirt, allowing himself to be strapped into his Boavad-enhanced bed, and enduring the muffled, off-key humming of his guards outside his lead-lined, garlic-scented, iron-barred windows. He would close his eyes, listening to the faint jingling of his own nightclothes as he shifted, a constant, irritating reminder of his unique predicament. He had hoped for sleep, perhaps even a dream of croissants, but mostly he felt the profound discomfort of a man who was now, literally, a prisoner of his own subconscious. The night sentinels, despite their new training and specialized equipment, remained perpetually exhausted. The constant vigilance, the fear of missing a single jingle of a royal bell, the pressure of preventing another international incident via sleepwalking, weighed heavily upon them. They became adept at silent patrols, at whispering reports, and at perfecting their lullaby technique. They found themselves developing a strange, almost paternal affection for their bewildered monarch, mingled with an enduring, weary exasperation. Sir Calen often mused that he missed the days when his greatest worry was a border skirmish. At least then, the enemy wore proper uniforms. The Ethelbergian court, initially horrified, eventually settled into a new, uncomfortable rhythm. The whispers persisted, of course, but they became less malicious and more resigned. The kingdom, in a strange twist of fate, had become known not for its predictable harvests or its delicate cheeses, though those were still consumed, if with a new, melancholic appreciation, but for its sleepwalking king and the absurd yet binding international treaty he had inadvertently spawned. Alaric was no longer just the king. He was the sleepwalking monarch, a living, jingling testament to the unpredictability of human nature and the surprising diplomatic power of an unconscious stroll. And so, the nights in Castle Athelberg were transformed. The familiar quiet was now punctuated by the soft, rhythmic jingling of silver bells, a faint, almost musical sound echoing through the fortified corridors. It was the sound of King Alaric turning in his sleep, perhaps dreaming of distant lands, or perhaps just attempting to reach a particularly elusive croissant in his slumber. And it was the sound of a kingdom, weary but determined, doing everything in its power to ensure that their king, for all his peculiarities, remained precisely where he belonged, tethered, bell-laden, and, most importantly, within the boundaries of Athelberg. The new royal sleep protocol was in full swing, a testament to collective anxiety, scientific absurdity, and the surprisingly durable spirit of royal embarrassment. And the night, though now filled with the gentle chime of bells, remained ever watchful, for Alaric's sleepwalking mind, as it had proven before, often found ways to defy even the most meticulously planned and ridiculous precaution. Chapter 16. The lingering questions the silver bells stitched onto King Alaric's nightshirt, once a source of profound personal mortification, had over time settled into a peculiar rhythm within the hallowed, if now slightly absurd, halls of Castle Ethelberg. Their faint, almost melodic tinkling had become the new unofficial soundtrack of the monarchy, a constant, gentle reminder of the new royal sleep protocol and the bizarre international treaty that had birthed it. The leather straps, sourced from a particularly placid Jersey cow and smelling faintly of hay, were now secured around his ankles and wrists each night with practiced ease by the night sentinels, a unit whose professional demeanor now oscillated between grim duty and a deep, world-weary sigh. The lead-lined, garlic-scented, moon-repelling curtains remained drawn, creating an atmosphere of perpetual, almost oppressive, nighttime within the royal bedchamber, a silent monument to Dr. Phineas Oakhaven's unyielding, if baffling, scientific conviction. Lord Chancellor Fitzwilliam, though still prone to bouts of profound despair over the cheese tariffs and the indignity of the Midnight Accord, had found a new, albeit fragile, sense of peace. The king, at least, remained within the borders. The quarterly cheese and honey shipments to Eldoria were, while financially irksome and a perpetual source of personal embarrassment, a predictable burden, far preferable to the sudden, panic-inducing calls of a monarch found attempting to barter royal heirlooms for root vegetables miles outside the capital. Miles and me of his own days was the award miles and wives. D. Fitzwilliam's office, however, now contained a growing stack of unusual diplomatic correspondence. There were quarterly reports from Eldoria detailing the consumption rates of Athelbergian summer bloom, and the occasional terse query about the precise sugar content of meadowsweet honey. Most unsettling were the requests, penned by Quill, the Eldorian royal scribe, on behalf of King Balthazar, for further, specific insights into Dr. Oakhaven's lunar-activated peptides, always with a vague yet chilling postscript about enhanced guard endurance or somnambulistic tactical advantages. Fitzwilliam would merely rub his temples, sigh, and forward the requests to Dr. Oakhaven, who, to Fitzwilliam's eternal bewilderment, seemed to relish the Eldorian interest. General Magnus, for his part, had incorporated the Ballad of the Stone Golem and the Restless Shepherd into the Night Sentinel's standard repertoire, alongside more traditional marching songs. He had even, to the astonishment of his drill sergeants, designed a series of nightshirt maneuvers, drills simulating the gentle redirection of a sleepwalking sovereign across treacherous terrain. His men, initially bewildered, had become surprisingly adept at moving silently, humming off-key lullabies, and on occasion even attempting to mimic the king's unconscious gait, much to the private amusement of Sir Caleb. Magnus still grumbled about the disgrace of it all, the utter lack of conventional warfare, but the absence of frantic midnight alarms had, undeniably, improved morale, if not his own sense of military purpose. The Eldorian request for research into weaponized somnambulism remained a source of profound unease for the general, a concept so absurdly horrifying it defied even his most vivid nightmares of combat. He often wondered if the Eldorians were truly serious, or if King Balthazar simply enjoyed torturing foreign military minds with preposterous hypothetical scenarios. Lady Beatrice, having recovered from her initial vapors, had adopted a new, almost performative, stoicism. She moved through the court with an air of dignified yet weary acceptance, subtly adjusting tapestries to conceal any lingering signs of the king's past nocturnal mishaps, and directing the conversation away from any mention of cheese tributes or the unfortunate fate of the royal crown. She still mourned the loss of the king's delicate croissants and insisted on a separate, heavily guarded supply of Jersey cow milk for Alaric, convinced that even the slightest deviation from Dr. Oakhaven's dairy prescription might trigger another catastrophic border breach. Her greatest challenge, however, was navigating the subtle, often sardonic, inquiries from visiting dignitaries who, having clearly heard the whispered tales, would inquire with thinly veiled amusement about the unique Athelbergian approach to foreign policy. Lady Beatrice, ever the diplomat, would merely offer a tight-lipped smile and launch into an overly detailed explanation of the delicate notes of summer bloom cheese. Dr. Phineas Oakhaven was, perhaps, the only individual in Ethelberg whose professional life had been unequivocally improved by the entire incident. The Eldorian interest in his lunar-activated peptides had elevated his status from eccentric court physician to an internationally recognized, if still widely misunderstood, pioneer in somnambulistic neurogastronomy. He spent his days in a flurry of activity, dissecting various types of goat milk, charting lunar cycles with renewed vigor, and scribbling endless, illegible notes in his journals. He eagerly corresponded with Eldorian scholars, receiving their gruff, pragmatic inquiries with the enthusiasm of a truffle hound presented with a particularly rare fungi. He even began to postulate new theories. Perhaps the precise temperature of a royal pillow influenced the trajectory of subconscious urges, or the specific weave of a nightshirt could inadvertently amplify certain nocturnal impulses. He was, in short, perpetually delighted, a small unkempt beacon of manic scientific joy, in a court still wrestling with second-hand embarrassment. Among the common people of Ethelberg, the story of their king's sleepwalking journey and the bizarre treaty it spawned had, predictably, become legend. It was whispered in taverns, recounted by bards with exaggerated gestures, and told to wide-eyed children around hearth fires on cold nights. King Alaric, once known only for his fairness and his quiet demeanor, was now King Alaric of the Jingling Nightshirt, or the Cheese Tribute King. His unintentional journey had lent a touch of the fantastical, a dash of the absurd, to the otherwise rather unremarkable history of Athelberg. There was a certain fondness for him, a quiet pride in the uniqueness of their monarch. He was their king, strange as he was, and his peculiar ailment had against all odds brought an unexpected, if bewildering, peace to the border. In Eldoria, the tale of the mad king of Athelberg, who traded cheese for the privilege of his sleepwalking, became a staple of King Balthazar's court, a permanent, grimly humorous fixture. Balthazar himself delighted in recounting the details of Alaric's earnest explanation, particularly the lunar-activated peptides and the moon-repelling curtains. He would often share the latest reports from Dr. Oakhaven with his generals, theorizing aloud about the tactical advantages of somnambulistic espionage or the potential for training a new breed of silent, nightshirt-clad infiltrators. The Eldorians, a people who appreciated stark truths and dry wit, found Alaric's predicament to be a truly magnificent demonstration of life's inherent absurdity. They enjoyed their cheese and honey, which they found surprisingly palatable once they overcame their initial skepticism, and they appreciated the relative quiet on their Athelbergian border. Borin and Fendrel, the border guards, found their duties less stressful, occasionally even taking bets on whether the Athelbergian messenger delivering the cheese would remember the full complement of summer bloom. And so, the quiet rhythm of the kingdom settled. King Alaric, jingling faintly as he turned in his sleep, remained securely tethered, a living, breathing, and occasionally snoring, testament to the success of the new royal sleep protocol. His subconscious, perhaps exhausted by his previous unprecedented journey, seemed content to explore the confines of his lead-lined bedchamber, or perhaps simply the taste of imaginary croissants. But for all the meticulous protocols, the diplomatic agreements, and the scientific theories, a lingering question remained, a quiet hum in the background of both kingdoms' lives. Was the entire incident, the sleepwalking, the accidental border crossing, the bizarre treaty, and the subsequent, albeit uncomfortable, peace, a stroke of diplomatic genius on King Balthazar's part, seizing an opportunity from the jaws of absurdity? Or was it simply sheer, dumb luck, a series of improbable coincidences that had delivered Alaric to a rival who, rather than imprisoning or executing him, had a profound, if dark, appreciation for farce? Perhaps in the end it was neither. Perhaps it was simply the universe, in its infinite, unknowable wisdom, exercising its own strange, ironic sense of humor. A cosmic joke played out on a grand geopolitical stage, starring a bewildered monarch, a gruff, amused king, and a court filled with tired, embarrassed, and thoroughly perplexed individuals. The incident had reshaped two kingdoms, not through war or grand conquests, but through the unpredictable whims of a sleeping mind and the lingering, baffling effects of fermented goat milk. And in the quiet hum of the night, punctuated by the soft, rhythmic jingling of silver bells, the people of Ethelberg and Eldoria continued to wonder, pondering the peculiar paths that sleep and fate could lead a king, quite unintentionally, into the wrong kingdom, and into the indelible annals of absurd history. The truth, like a phantom footprint in the dew-kissed moor, remained just out of reach, eternally baffling, eternally amusing, and eternally, profoundly peculiar.